This young man succeeded in going back in time after everything was destroyed. Not only that, but he also obtained a method that allows him to steal all the treasures of the gods. What will he do with this incredible power? And will he be able to fix the situation? This is what we will discover in our story. The Greed Demon led the demon hordes and established the 10,000 Demons Temple by extracting gold from the mountains of hell. The 10,000 Demons Temple was originally located on the top floor of the tower, but after the Heavenly Demonic War, all remnants of the demonic forces, including the temple, were moved from the tower's peak. Eventually, all demonic powers were eradicated, but the tower didn't enjoy peace for long as it was attacked by an unknown enemy, later called the Outsider. This enemy managed to expel the constellations with an immense power far beyond anything they had ever known. In the end, even the players who had lost their powers were eradicated. In this reality, where all players were destroyed, the tower faced a dire situation. The scene shifts to our hero, Jeong, who couldn't believe that the 10,000 Demons Temple had been moved to the 92nd floor. But he felt grateful for finding it, as it might give them a chance to turn the tide. Jeong was searching for something specific hidden in the temple, the Vault of Greed. This vault could allow him to turn back time and change the course of events. Indeed, Jeong arrives at the temple, and upon entering, a window appears telling him he is the first human to reach this place. He feels relieved that he has finally reached his goal. The temple was grand and radiated a yellow glow due to the vast amounts of gold filling it. Suddenly, the walls begin to shake, and Jeong realizes something has pinpointed his location. Knowing he must complete his mission quickly, he activates a unique skill called Journey's Guide, the strongest exploration and search skill among all skills. Without this skill, it would have been impossible for Jeong to find the 10,000 Demons Temple, or survive this long. After activating the skill, a golden indicator appears, and Jeong asks it to lead him to the Vault of Greed. Jeong quickly follows the indicator, but to his surprise, he reaches a dead end. The indicator stops at a candelabra hanging on the wall, and Jeong wonders if he should touch it. Indeed, he pulls the candelabra from the wall and is surprised when a secret door opens, leading to a large room. Jeong descends a staircase and continues until he reaches a gate he believes to be the entrance to the Vault of Greed. He pulls out a key and smiles, saying he never imagined he would thank someone named Felchus. Just remembering what happened with Felchus makes him feel annoyed. In a flashback, we see the key in Jeong's possession being thrown to the ground, and Jeong sitting in front of Felchus, who laughs and tells him that his share is that key because they don't have the money to pay him. Jeong yells, saying this was not the agreement, and if things continue like this, he won't continue with them. Felchus responds by saying that quitting the guild would end his future as an adventurer, and asks him with a sly look if he's ready for that. The scene returns to the present, where Jeong remembers that at the time, he didn't know the key's importance. He uses it to unlock the gate in front of him, and at that moment, the key's golden feature activates, transforming into the golden key of greed, used to open the Vault of Greed. Jeong is shocked when he sees the immense quantity of treasures before him. He moves between the astonishing treasures, the likes of which he had never seen in his life. A terrifying cursed sword, the Heavenly Demon's Martial Arts Manual, an ancient magic book for completing the forgotten 8th circle, and even the heart of a dragon. He couldn't comprehend how all these treasures had been gathered in one place. At that moment, he feels the increasing tremors in the ground and realizes that the creature chasing him is getting closer. For this reason, he wastes no time and activates the Journey's Guide skill again. The golden indicator appears before him, and Jeong asks it to lead him to the treasure he seeks. The arrow stops at a mountain of gold coins, and Jeong begins to move them aside, wondering if the treasure he's searching for is beneath them. Indeed, he finally finds what he was looking for, the Hourglass of Chronos. This hourglass, crafted by the ruler of time, Chronos, holds the power to reverse time. Jeong thinks about how he could return to the past to stop the demonic war, climb the tower, and confront the outsider, potentially preventing the current catastrophe the tower is facing. Jeong flips the Hourglass of Chronos, and it emits a powerful aura as it begins to activate. A window appears, informing him that time within the tower will reverse to the moment of the beginning, and that this process will take 10 minutes. Jeong decides that after returning to the past, he will do everything in his power to prevent the current disaster from occurring. At that moment, the ground shakes more violently, and several tendrils pierce through the ceiling, attacking Jeong. He dodges them quickly, feeling a surge of anger for being discovered at such a critical moment. The outsider bursts into the room, revealing its form, resembling an octopus with snake-like tentacles. It attacks Jeong again, but Jeong manages to evade the assault. He's shocked when he notices something in front of him. He remembers that this place holds not only treasures, but also the weapons of the rulers. Jeong grabs Zeus's thunder spear and decides to make the most of the remaining time before the time reversal. He hurls the spear at the outsider, who gets struck by an enormous electric shock, screaming in agony. However, the outsider manages to withstand the attack and strikes at Jeong again. Jeong grows frustrated as he realizes his opponent is stronger than he anticipated. In that moment, Jeong sees a sword engulfed in a powerful fiery aura. He wonders if it could be Leviathan, the sword of destruction. He quickly grabs it, thinking that the power of the ruler's weapons should definitely be enough, especially since this sword was specifically crafted to burn the world. Jeong charges at the outsider at incredible speed, while the latter launches its tendrils to stop him. Jeong dodges the tendrils and gets closer, delivering a direct blow that turns the outsider into a blazing mass of fire. Jeong knew that the outsider was covered by an outer layer protecting its true body. He looks closely and finally discovers the true form of the outsider. Surprised to find that it resembles a boar, Jeong grows tense as he realizes that the energy of Leviathan has run out, and the outsider viciously attacks him. At that moment, he spots beside him Bryonak, the radiant spear, the weapon of the ruler of light, known for its ability to pierce through anything. Jeong quickly grabs the spear and prepares to hurl it at the outsider, wondering if this attack will finally end the fight. The spear shoots out at incredible speed, piercing through the outsider's body completely. A bright explosion occurs upon impact, blinding Jeong momentarily. As the chaos fades, Jeong stands in awe of the spear's power. Suddenly, a congratulatory window appears in front of him, informing him that he is the first player to successfully defeat an outsider. At the same moment, the countdown for Chronos' hourglass ends, and it begins to activate. The Vault of Greed starts to collapse, and another window appears, notifying Jeong that since he is the only player inside the vault and holds the golden key, he will be recognized as the new owner of the Vault of Greed. Additionally, for defeating the outsider Mao, the glutton, he is granted the authority of gluttony. Jeong is astonished, not fully understanding what this authority entails. At the same time, Chronos' hourglass completes its setup, and all of Jeong's skills are erased, along with resetting all the experience he had gained throughout his journey in the tower. Then, Jeong is sent back in time to the moment the tutorial began. The scene shifts to a forest, where a group of people is suddenly transported to this location. They are bewildered, questioning where they have been taken. At this moment, a window appears before each of them, welcoming them to the tutorial. Everyone is confused, and no one knows what's happening. The only person who doesn't seem surprised is our hero, Jeong, who wonders if he has truly succeeded in returning to the past. One of the people demands that someone explain what's happening, and another person responds that they are all in the same situation and no one knows anything. Jeong observes that people are just as panicked as they were the first time, and he decides to keep his distance from them. Suddenly, someone grabs him by the arm, asking if he knows anything about what's going on, or if they are there because of some crime they committed. When Jeong looks at the man, he remembers that this person was brutally killed during the previous tutorial, his throat having been slashed. Jeong calmly tells the man to stay composed, but the man is too agitated and screams, asking how he's supposed to be calm in such a situation. The man clutches his head, wondering if what's happening is some kind of prank or a hidden camera show. Jeong knows that no matter what he says now, no one will listen to him, and things will only settle down once the wave begins. At that moment, a window appears before everyone, announcing the start of the first chapter of the tutorial, titled Adaptation, with a countdown showing that there are only 4 minutes and 21 seconds before the first monster wave begins. Everyone is confused and doesn't understand what a monster wave means. Meanwhile, Jeong checks his status window and notices that everything appears exactly as it did the first time, except now he has 2 new skills, Authority of Greed and Authority of Gluttony, though he doesn't yet know what they are. He recalls the windows that appeared during the collapse of the Vault of Greed and wonders if he can use these powers. Jeong tries activating the Authority of Greed, and suddenly a treasure chest appears in his hand. He is surprised when the chest opens automatically, and the system informs him that the Vault of Greed has been unlocked. From it, he obtains Dragon's Fire Breath and Thor's Hammer, along with martial arts techniques from the Heavenly Master. Jeong becomes excited, realizing that with this authority, he can definitely use its power to gain the strength needed to face the outsiders. At that moment, the first chapter of the tutorial begins, and the first wave of monsters appears. Players are instructed to defeat these monsters to prove their strength. The ground suddenly begins to tremble, and the players become tense, not knowing what to do. The players are shocked when they see a pack of wolves approaching, wondering if these are the monster wave they were warned about. In an instant, the wolves charge at the players, attacking them viciously. The players panic and scream at the top of their lungs as they try to flee, but they run into another group of wolves, becoming trapped from all sides. They frantically ask what they should do and whether they're about to die in this situation. Jeong steps in at that moment, telling them that if they want to survive, they need to fight. One of them shouts at him, asking if Jeong doesn't understand the dangerous situation they're in and how they can fight without weapons. The person is surprised when another individual steps forward and asks Jeong if he has a plan. This person is named Kang, a towering figure so tall that the person who was shouting at Jeong is shocked when he looks up at him. Jeong adjusts his clothes and replies that it's simple. They just need to focus on defense while he handles the monsters. Kang responds that he doesn't have a problem with that, but doesn't understand how Jeong plans to deal with all the monsters by himself. Jeong opens the Vault of Greed and retrieves the 10 Paths of Martial Arts book, which contains a simple leg technique that enhances the efficiency of his strikes. Jeong activates the book to learn the technique and tests his newfound power. A wolf charges at him, and Jeong uses the 10 Paths of Martial Arts to deliver a powerful kick, instantly killing it. Afterward, 3 more enraged wolves rush at him, but Jeong doesn't wait for their attack. Instead, he charges toward them at incredible speed, spins in the air, and lands a powerful kick to the ground, shattering it and taking out several wolves in the process. Everyone is astonished by what Jeong did, unable to believe how he fought the wolves without any weapons. Even Kang is surprised when he sees Jeong's strength, confirming his suspicions that Jeong is powerful, though he didn't expect him to defeat the wolves so easily. Kang feels something strange inside him, a burning sensation, and wonders what it could be. At that moment, a wolf attacks him, but the wolf is shocked when its fangs can't pierce Kang's body. Kang is visibly annoyed by the wolf interrupting his thoughts. He grabs the wolf by its head and slams it into the ground with immense force, leaving the 2 people standing beside him in shock. They wonder if they could do something similar. One of them calls out, asking if anyone has a weapon they can use to fight the wolves. Meanwhile, Kang focuses on Jeong as he fights the wolves. He notices that Jeong's strength doesn't just come from his physical power, but also from his unique fighting style. Kang realizes that Jeong fights in a completely different manner than he does. Clenching his fists with a strong desire to fight alongside someone like Jeong, Kang feels a deep urge to test himself. After a while, Jeong starts feeling exhausted after taking down a large number of wolves and notices that the wave is nearing its end. He realizes that his body is now much weaker than it was in the previous phase, and that he needs to find a solution to this problem. But suddenly, he is hit with a strange sensation and begins to wonder about its source. Jeong briefly senses an overwhelming presence, and a window appears, informing him that the Bent Raven constellation is watching him. Jeong tenses up when he realizes he has attracted the attention of a constellation, especially the Bent Raven, the original owner of the Vault of Greed. He looks up at the sky, unable to believe that the greed demon is observing him, and wonders if it noticed his use of the vault's power. He feels a growing fear, knowing that if the Bent Raven discovered him using elements from the vault without permission, it wouldn't remain silent. Jeong starts considering what he should do next, wondering if he needs to hide his power. He understands that if the Bent Raven discovers he's been using its power without approval, he could be punished immediately. At that moment, another window appears, informing Jeong that the Bent Raven noticed traces of temporal distortion around him, and nodded as if recalling the existence of the hourglass. Jeong is shocked by this message and grows even more anxious. However, another window appears, telling him that the Bent Raven smiled. The situation returns to normal, and Jeong finds himself in disbelief that the Bent Raven didn't take any action against him, despite knowing he had used Chronos' hourglass. He wonders if the Bent Raven had anticipated what had happened, and is puzzled by its lack of reaction. Jeong feels that this gesture from the Bent Raven could be a tacit approval, causing him to smile as he tells himself that if this is the case, he should use this power in the best way possible. He decides to check the authority of gluttony. the power he gained after defeating Mao, the glutton. Jeong tries activating the authority, but a window appears, telling him he must first select a target. He looks around and sees nothing but the corpses of the wolves he had killed. Wondering if the authority would work on the dead, he extends his hand toward one of the wolf corpses and tries activating the authority again. Sharp tendrils emerge from his hand, resembling those possessed by the outsider, and begin consuming the bodies of the slain wolves. A window appears, informing him that he successfully consumed a gray wolf, and as a result, his strength increased by 1 point and his agility by 2 points. Jeong is stunned when he realizes that he can increase his stats simply by consuming corpses. Smiling, he says that if he can freely use this authority, he could quickly maximize his physical strength. However, his smile fades as a thought crosses his mind. If what happened with the greed demon could happen again, the gluttony demons might also notice him after using their power. Jeong begins to regret his hasty use of the authority of gluttony without considering the potential risks. He wonders if he made a mistake by using this power too early, exposing himself to the surveillance and potential dangers posed by greater forces. Indeed, a notification window appears, informing Jeong that the Hungry Prince constellation has stopped chewing on a wolf leg and looks astonished. Kang, upon seeing this notification, feels uneasy and gulps, thinking he narrowly escaped the greed demon by luck, but it's hard to believe he'll get away unscathed this time as well. However, he's surprised when the system informs him that the Hungry Prince opened his mouth as if to say something, but then continued chewing his food as usual. Jeong couldn't believe that a demon from the evil faction, one of the strongest demons, had lost focus over a bit of meat. He wonders if the prince is truly that hungry and smiles, thinking that if this is the case, he might be able to use it to his advantage. Jeong activates the authority of gluttony once again, saying that if the Hungry Prince is that desperate to eat, he'll give him what he wants. The tendrils from Jeong's hand extend again, devouring the remaining wolf corpses in the area. Another notification window appears, telling him that the Hungry Prince is pleased with the unexpected feast, making Jeong smile and relax, knowing his plan worked as expected. This time, he gains another boost in strength and agility from consuming the corpses, though the increase is smaller than the first time. Jeong is satisfied, as he wasn't aiming to raise his stats in this moment. Looking up toward the sky, Jeong asks the Hungry Prince if he's had enough, and the system replies that the prince's mouth is watering as he says what he ate was just an appetizer. Jeong smirks and says, "That's exactly what I'd expect from a gluttony demon." After some time, the players finally manage to defeat all the monsters. Everyone feels a sense of joy and begins to cheer in celebration. The system appears to inform them that they have successfully cleared the first wave of the first chapter of the tutorial, and each player is rewarded with 50 points. Jeong watches the situation unfold with relief, seeing that the first wave ended without any casualties among the players. He recalls that in his previous life, there were losses during this wave, and wonders if the difference this time was that he personally defeated more than half of the monsters. At that moment, the system begins calculating individual contributions. Jeong ranks first with 220 points, followed by Kang with 80 points in second place, and a girl named Yu comes in third with 40 points. Jeong reflects, thinking that earning 220 points makes sense. In the tutorial, points are earned based on individual contributions, and the higher the points and ranking, the better the rewards for completing the tutorial, as well as increasing a player's chances of being chosen by a constellation. With this in mind, Jeong sets his goal, to always claim the top rank. Jeong looks at the other players around him and realizes that, although they successfully survived the first wave, he has identified a crucial need, a weapon. Even with access to the Vault of Greed, his low stats still pose a significant challenge. He needs a weapon to compensate for this weakness. However, the problem is that there are no decent weapons in the immediate area. Determined, Jeong decides to venture into the forest to increase his stats and search for something useful. As he enters the forest, he thinks that by boosting his stats, he'll be able to unlock better treasures from the Vault of Greed. At that moment, Jeong hears someone calling his name and turns around. A girl approaches him, asking about his destination. Jeong wonders who she is, feeling that her voice is familiar. He is surprised when she gets closer, and he recognizes her as Yu, known as the Whirlwind in his previous life. While Jeong doesn't remember everyone from this place, Yu is unforgettable. She, along with Kang, was one of the top-ranked individuals in the tower, and even in the higher levels she was well known. Yu approaches Jeong and asks where he's going alone. Jeong feels frustrated because every minute in the tutorial is precious, and he doesn't have the luxury of wasting time dealing with people right now. He replies that he prefers exploring the area rather than standing around aimlessly. Yu tells him that instead of wasting time exploring, it would be better to gather everyone and discuss what they will do for the second wave. Jeong asks if that will make a difference, and she responds that at the very least, it would help reduce the tension among the others. Jeong grows annoyed because he doesn't have time for such discussions and can't explain all the details to her. He tells her that he's not interested in reducing tension, especially since everyone will start panicking as soon as the monsters reappear. Yu yells, saying that even if what he says is true, they don't know when the monsters will show up again, and wandering off alone could be dangerous. At that moment, both of them are surprised when a window appears, showing them the remaining time before the second wave, 2 hours and 57 minutes. Jeong turns his back to Yu, telling her to return to the others and pay attention to the system messages. He adds that during this time, she can discuss or do whatever she wants. Before leaving, he advises her to look for a sturdy branch or something similar that can be used as a weapon. After spending some time deeper in the forest, Jeong encounters a brown wolf and kills it, surrounded by the corpses of many wolves he had already slain. He thinks this is the perfect moment to increase his stats. Using the authority of gluttony, he begins devouring the wolf corpses. However, after consuming a significant number of brown wolves, the system shows him a window, informing him that he can no longer gain stats from them. Another window appears, telling him that the hungry prince has grown tired of eating this kind of meat. Jeong smiles and says, "That's exactly what I'd expect from a gluttony demon." He then tells the hungry prince to wait a moment while he searches for something more fitting to his tastes. Jeong grabs a tree branch and decides to test something. Activating the authority of greed, he pulls the Chosen One's sword from the Vault of Greed. He notices that the treasures he draws from the vault appear as pure energy, with no physical form. He suspects that these treasures have lost their physical manifestation, though their energy remains intact. Jeong feels a bit frustrated by this, but he doesn't consider it a major issue. He believes all he needs to do is merge the treasure's energy into a suitable object. He tries merging the Chosen One's sword into the tree branch he's holding, but is shocked when he feels intense heat radiating from the branch, which then evaporates in his hand, causing the fusion to fail. Jeong realizes that the branch couldn't withstand the sword's energy, which is why it disintegrated. He starts to worry when he deduces that the same thing could happen to him. Fortunately, the only item he had used on himself was a simple martial arts technique, which his body managed to adapt to. However, had he used something stronger, like the dragon's fire breath, he might have turned to ash, just like the branch. Jeong decides to test using a useless treasure on one of the brown wolves, but the process fails, making him realize that he can't use authority of greed treasures on anyone other than himself. Once he understands these limitations, he concludes that he won't be able to utilize many of the treasures, which leads him to the only solution, increasing his personal abilities so that he can handle more powerful treasures in the future. Although this realization frustrates him, Jeong decides to focus on finding a weapon first. After a while of searching with no luck, he grows increasingly irritated at his inability to find anything useful. At that moment, an idea strikes him, and he decides to test it. He opens the Vault of Greed and retrieves something called Hyena's Nose. After merging it with his body, Jeong begins to smell a specific scent and quickly follows it, realizing that it's the smell of rust. This convinces him that he's close to finding something valuable. Just then, a system message appears, informing Jeong that the hungry prince is starting to complain, wanting to eat soon. Jeong feels exasperated, as it feels more like he's taking care of a pig than dealing with a constellation. Jeong continues running until he becomes exhausted and pauses to catch his breath, certain that he's close to the source of the scent. But suddenly, he picks up another smell. He turns around to see a strange beast approaching him. As the creature comes into full view, Jeong realizes it's a gray wolf. He understands that the wolf must have tracked him by scent, just as he was doing. Jeong thinks to himself that in his previous life, he would have run away from such situations, but this time is different. He activates his power and prepares for battle. The wolf lunges at him with its mouth open, but Jeong dodges the attack and quickly retreats. He notices that the wolf isn't just larger than the average gray wolves. It's also faster, meaning it's no ordinary monster. Jeong confirms this when he feels a small wound on his neck. Despite believing he had dodged the attack completely, he realizes that the wolf was aiming to end his life with a single strike by targeting a vital point. Jeong feels grateful for the 10 steps technique he learned. Without it, his fate could have been much worse. The wolf charges at him again, and Jeong manages to dodge, circling around the beast and delivering a powerful kick. However, Jeong is surprised when the attack doesn't have the impact he expected. He quickly retreats, feeling his leg tremble as if it had struck something solid. He wonders if this is due to his low stats. Jeong was certain that his kick had struck the wolf's belly, but he couldn't understand how its stomach could be so hard. The wolf continued its relentless attack, and Jeong found himself struggling to handle the powerful beast. He tried to think of a solution, telling himself that there must be a way to defeat the wolf. His heart sank when 2 more gray wolves appeared, joining the fight. Feeling tense, Jeong began to retreat slowly, realizing that with the increased pace of attacks, escaping might be impossible. However, just then, he spotted the rusty sword he had been searching for lying next to him. He quickly grabbed the sword as the gray wolves charged at him. Despite its worn appearance, Jeong felt confident as he wielded the blade, knowing that its sharpness remained intact. He slashed at one of the wolves, easily cutting it down. Smiling, Jeong thought to himself that this weapon was exactly what he needed at this stage. Next, he turned his attention to the second gray wolf and dispatched it with similar ease. At that moment, a message from the system appeared, informing him that the bent raven was watching him with amazement. Jeong felt a rush of excitement after obtaining the weapon he had sought, and he wasn't about to back down now. He decided to finish the battle before the second wave of monsters could begin. He activated the Vault of Greed and retrieved the Hamel family swordsmanship, a simple yet effective technique passed down through the family's generations. Jeong activated the technique within himself and looked at the remaining gray wolf, declaring that things were about to change from now on. The wolf let out a fierce roar and charged at him. Jeong braced himself, gripping the sword tightly in preparation for the clash. The wolf's powerful jaws clamped down on the blade, but Jeong seized the opportunity to unleash a series of rapid strikes against the beast, leaving deep wounds that caused blood to spill. Jeong felt exhilarated by the effectiveness of the swordsmanship technique and remarked that this was what he expected from one of the finest sword techniques in the Empire. With newfound speed and confidence, Jeong rushed toward the wolf to finish it off. As the wolf opened its mouth to strike, Jeong saw his chance and plunged the sword deep into its throat, ending the battle and slaying the creature. The system notified him that he had defeated the Grey Wolf, the leader of the wolf forest. Jeong smiled as his level increased, gaining 500 individual contribution points, along with the Grey Wolf's pelt as a reward. Aside from obtaining the weapon, Jeong had another goal: increasing his contribution points. He knew that contribution points could be earned in multiple ways. The first was by participating in battles and eliminating monsters in the tutorial. The second method was to hunt down monsters separately and defeat them. And the third, though not possible now, was to defeat other players. Jeong was aware that toward the end of the tutorial, many players would begin fighting one another, as it provided a huge opportunity to gain points. In that moment, Jeong activated the authority of gluttony on the Grey Wolf's corpse. After consuming it, he gained 3 points in strength, 5 points in agility, and 2 points in health. Jeong was thrilled with the boost in stats he received after defeating the wolf leader. A window appeared, informing him that the hungry prince was satisfied with the taste of the meat and wanted Jeong to maintain this level of quality at all times. Jeong decides to inspect the items he obtained before returning to the group. He starts with the Chosen One's sword and discovers that it has 2 special abilities. The first is Poison, which slows down the healing of wounds caused by the sword, and the second is Hero's Mark, which increases attack power by 10% against monsters. Next, Jeong examines the Grey Wolf pelt, which also has special abilities. The first is Authority, which grants the wearer strong charisma in front of allies and strikes fear into the hearts of enemies. And the second is Wind's Blessing, which increases movement speed by 5%. Both the sword and the pelt are rated D-, but Jeong sees potential in the pelt's abilities and decides that he'll work to upgrade it to D+ in the future. At that moment, a message from the system appears, informing him that the bent raven is eyeing his weapon, commenting that it's not too bad. Jeong smirks and thinks to himself that this is exactly what he'd expect from the greed demon, who can't ignore anything that piques its interest. Jeong wonders how much time is left before the second wave begins and discovers he has only 12 minutes. He quickly puts on the wolf pelt and starts moving, but he still doesn't make it back in time. The second wave begins while he's still in the forest. He feels mildly annoyed, knowing that he promised Yu he would return before the wave started, but he brushes it off, thinking it's not important enough to concern him. He decides that this is a good chance to see how the others handle themselves, telling himself that he doesn't plan to surround himself with unreliable people who would only become a burden. When he finally arrives at the battlefield, Jeong notices that the players are surprised because this wave consists of wild boars. He hears one player yelling at his friend, who is fleeing, but the friend isn't listening and says he can't take it anymore. Meanwhile, Kang is locked in combat with one of the boars, and Yu lands a strong blow on another. Jeong observes one of the players, a man who used to be a powerful corporate manager, shouting at a younger player who was once his employee, demanding that he protect him. The older man kicks the younger one and threatens him with job loss if he doesn't fight properly. Jeong watches this unfold and mutters to himself that there are always despicable people like this. He looks at the other players and notices that many of them are fighting better than he expected, especially Kang and Yu, despite not having decent gear, which he attributes to their innate strength. At that moment, Jeong decides to step in. Yu, visibly exhausted, is gasping for breath. She feels grateful for the branch Jeong had given her, thinking that without it, she would likely be dead by now. She mutters to herself that these boars are much stronger than the wolves they faced before. While dodging an attack from one of the boars, Yu gets injured in her leg and starts bleeding. In that moment, she recalls Jeong's last words before he left for the forest. Though she doesn't understand why she's remembering them now, the boar charges at her with incredible speed, and Yu, feeling panicked, doesn't know what to do. In this critical moment, she realizes that her physical abilities have deteriorated due to exhaustion and injury. She doesn't have the time or strength to defend herself against the advancing threat. She forces herself to stand, trying to brace for the boar's charge, though she's unsure if she can survive the attack. Just as the boar is about to strike, everyone is shocked as the beast is suddenly sliced clean in half. Jeong appears, having killed the boar with a single slash from his sword. He stands confidently, placing his foot on the boar's carcass, exuding a commanding presence. Yu was about to say something, but Jeong interrupted her, pointing his sword toward a group of wild boars charging toward them. He told her they needed to deal with them first. Yu tensed up as she glanced in the direction Jeong indicated and saw 3 boars approaching rapidly. Jeong opened the Vault of Greed and retrieved an item called Orc Tendons, which enhanced strength and flexibility. He infused the tendons into his body, unsure if he could withstand them. However, he knew he would only find out by trying. He was able to dodge an attack from one of the boars in an instant and delivered a powerful slash with his sword, easily taking it down. Gripping his sword tightly, Jeong prepared to face the 2 remaining boars. He delivered a strong blow to each of them, cutting them in half with ease. Both Yu and Kang were astonished at how Jeong had effortlessly defeated the 3 boars. Jeong smiled, feeling his strength increase and his control over it improve thanks to the orc tendons. At that moment, someone placed a hand on Jeong's shoulder. It was the arrogant manager who had been shouting at the others earlier. The manager praised Jeong for fighting well, noting that he was on a completely different level from the useless players. He then asked Jeong if he would agree to become his personal bodyguard, proudly mentioning that he was the owner of Ton Co. He promised to reward Jeong handsomely if he agreed. Jeong wasn't particularly interested in what the manager had to say, but the man continued to talk, offering Jeong the position of department head in his company if he could protect him. Smiling, Jeong said the offer sounded amazing. The manager, thinking Jeong was about to agree, grinned in return, only to be shocked when Jeong said he was actually looking for a shield he could use. The manager became nervous and asked what Jeong meant. Suddenly, Jeong kicked him to the ground. The manager screamed and insulted Jeong, accusing him of being crazy, but he quickly fell silent when he heard a loud noise from behind. Turning around, the manager was horrified to see a group of wild boars charging at him at full speed. He screamed in terror, but Jeong completely ignored him, letting the boars take care of him. For a moment, silence filled the area as everyone stood in shock at what had just happened. Meanwhile, the bent raven watched the scene unfold with a sly smile, while the hungry prince screamed, wanting a delicious meal that didn't include the arrogant manager who had just been killed. After some time, the players finally managed to eliminate all the remaining monsters. The system congratulated them on their success, awarding each of them an additional 50 points. Everyone was relieved that the second wave had finally ended. The system began calculating individual contributions, and as usual, Jeong took first place with a total of 1,080 points. Kang came in second with 180 points, while Yu placed third with 100 points. Jeong used the authority of gluttony on the boar carcasses, increasing his strength by 1 point and his vitality by 2 points. The hungry prince devoured the boars happily, eagerly awaiting more. Jeong decided to keep one of the boar carcasses for later consumption, remembering how in his previous life he had only fed on wolf meat and knew well how bad predator meat tasted. Jeong began cutting the boar meat with his rusty sword, which, despite its condition, was the only tool available to him at the moment. At that moment, a kind-looking girl approached and apologized for interrupting. When he turned to her, she smiled shyly and explained that she used to run a small restaurant and had some experience in butchering meat. She grew excited when Jeong agreed to let her help, telling her that he would rely on her expertise. Soon, a group of people gathered around them. One person offered to collect wood for a fire, another said they would set up a camp for the night, and others volunteered to search for a nearby water source. However, after gathering some wood, they encountered a problem. They didn't know how to start the fire. At that moment, Jeong opened the Vault of Greed and retrieved an item called the Kasha Ember, a coal infused with the power of a fire spirit. Despite its small size, it contained an unquenchable spiritual energy. Jeong summoned the ember into his hand and told everyone to use it to start the fire. A short while later, the boar meat had been roasted and was ready to eat. Jeong took a piece of it and went off to eat by himself. As soon as he tasted the meat, he noticed the hungry prince licking his lips at the savory smell, causing Jeong to sigh in frustration, thinking that he had a right to enjoy the food too. Just then, Yu approached him with a small container of water and offered it to him. She sat beside him and noticed his sword, asking if he had found it in the forest. Jeong replied that he had been lucky. As he looked at her, he realized she might also need a sword, especially since she was known for her skill with them, and the wooden branch she was carrying was limiting her abilities. Jeong directed Yu's attention to the system window, where she discovered she had 100 points. She asked him what they were for, and he explained that she could use the points to purchase a sword. Yu was surprised and asked him to show her how. Jeong told her to press on her points, and a shop menu appeared. Yu followed his instructions and felt like the process resembled a video game. Jeong reminded her of his earlier advice about the importance of adapting to the system if she wanted to survive. Yu selected one of the swords available in the shop, and she was amazed when the sword materialized out of thin air. She admired the weapon and asked Jeong how he knew all of this. Smiling, Jeong simply said that he had adapted quickly to the situation. Yu laughed and admitted that she thought she had been quick to adapt, but now realized that Jeong was far ahead of her. Jeong was slightly surprised when she called him by name, and she pointed to the leaderboard where Jeong's name appeared in first place. Yu smiled at Jeong and said that a wise person had advised her to pay close attention to the system. She then thanked him for his advice and for teaching her how to use her points. Jeong smiled in return, telling her that there was no need for thanks and that he looked forward to cooperating more with her in the future. As time passed, the players settled down for the night. The next morning, they woke up, and Yu called for them to gather. There was only 1 hour left before the third wave was set to begin, and some of the players grew anxious, wondering what steps to take. Yu gave orders. She instructed one group to gather rocks to throw at the monsters, another group to provide support and protect the others from the rear, while the remaining players were told to find sturdy branches to use as weapons. Jeong watched the situation unfold and felt that things were very different this time. He believed the difference was Yu. Having someone to lead and direct the group had significantly reduced the panic among the players. Jeong thought that this was a good thing, as it would allow him to focus more on himself. Jeong opens the Vault of Greed and retrieves an item called the Blue Mana Circle, a secret training method for mages that has been passed down through generations in the Blue Tower, one of the 7 greatest magical towers. Although the Blue Mana Circle is known to be the least effective among the 7 towers, there are numerous training methods available to enhance it. Jeong decides to start by establishing a foundation using the Blue Towers method, planning to build on it later with more advanced training techniques. In addition to focusing on mana, Jeong also makes sure not to forget the importance of Dantian, as mana is essential for magic, while martial arts rely heavily on the Dantian. He sits in a meditative position and begins applying the Blue Tower's training method to form his mana circle. Controlling his breathing, he concentrates until he feels energy responding from his lungs. Carefully, he attempts to unify this energy with his heart. Only the energy that aligns with him successfully merges, and a window appears, informing him of his success in forming the first mana circle using the Blue Tower's method. Now, Jeong is able to gather mana and use magic. The system informs him that the strength and speed of his spells will depend on the level of his mana circle. As forming the first mana circle is considered a significant achievement, Jeong is awarded 1,000 contribution points. Another window appears, telling him that the three sister constellations are watching him with wide eyes, followed by a message that the Heavenly Mother is impressed, as well as the Seer. Jeong notices that many magical entities have taken an interest in him, but he recalls that he already has the support of the Bent Raven and the Hungry Prince. Considering their ranks, he knows that these two rulers are of higher status than the constellations currently showing interest. Just then, another window appears, informing him that the Hungry Prince is irritated by the presence of these unwanted guests. A subsequent window tells Jeong that the Bent Raven is also annoyed and has withdrawn a treasure from the Vault of Greed. At that moment, Kang notices that the constellation windows suddenly disappear, surprising him. A new message informs Jeong that the Bent Raven has blocked all communications from lower-ranked constellations. Jeong is shocked, realizing that even high-ranking entities need considerable effort to interfere with the system in this way. He begins to wonder if the Bent Raven and the Hungry Prince wield so much control that they can prevent other constellations from meddling. Another message appears, stating that the Hungry Prince feels relieved after the troublesome guests have been silenced, and a further message notes that the Bent Raven is watching him calmly. With the situation returning to normal, Jeong decides to continue his mana training. Although the Blue Tower method is known for its lower efficiency, he can still feel the steady growth of his mana circle as his training progresses. At that moment, someone approaches him and asks if he's asleep, interrupting his training. Annoyed by the voice, Jeong opens his eyes to see a figure standing before him. The person explains that they thought he was dead because he had been sitting in the same spot for an hour without moving. Jeong responds calmly, asking if there's something the person wants. The person approaching Jeong is Park, someone Jeong remembers vividly from his past life. Park had been a vile person, bullying the weak and stealing food from the elderly. Now Park seemed to be trying to cozy up to Jeong, likely because of Jeong's newfound strength. Jeong knew that Park was the type to act strong against the weak, but weak against the strong. Park awkwardly tells Jeong that he noticed Jeong didn't have any friends and suggests they become friends. Jeong clearly remembers the bitter experiences he endured because of Park in his previous life, including the time Park forced him to enter the forest under the guise of exploring it. Although that experience led Jeong to discover the powerful guide skill, it had been a miserable event. Jeong responds to Park with an odd question. "Can you run fast?" Park is taken aback and asks why Jeong is asking. Jeong moves closer, placing a hand on Park's shoulder, surprising him, before quietly telling Park that he intends to use him as bait. Time passes, and the third wave begins. Everyone is prepared, holding spears they crafted from tree branches. The monsters of the third wave appear, armed monkeys, wielding various weapons. Yu shouts commands, telling everyone to stay ready and stick to the plan. As the monkeys approach, the players in the front lines use their spears to fend off a few, but the sheer number of the monsters creates rising tension. One of the players asks Yu what they should do now. Yu grows anxious, realizing that their formation is on the verge of collapsing under the pressure of the overwhelming enemy numbers. She wonders if there's any way out of the situation. At that moment, Jeong orders Park to initiate the plan. Park, holding a banana in his hand, nervously asks if Jeong is sure about what he's doing. Frustrated, Jeong pushes Park with his foot, urging him to hurry up. Park falls to the ground and, to his horror, finds two monkeys staring at him hungrily, drooling as they glare at him with savage intensity. Panicking, Park looks up to see a group of ravenous monkeys closing in on him. Terrified, Park starts running as fast as he can, screaming at the top of his lungs while a horde of monkeys chases after him. Jeong smirks, remarking to himself that Park is faster than he expected, thinking he might have taken a few hits during his escape. Park, now desperate, yells at Jeong to save him, saying he can't take it anymore. Jeong coldly responds, telling Park to come toward him. Park shouts back in despair that he's already on his way. At that moment, Jeong opens the Vault of Greed, and a fiery energy surrounds him. He tells Park to dodge what's coming, which shocks Park, who frantically asks what Jeong is planning to do. Jeong retrieves a spell crafted by a skilled mage from the Red Tower. The spell works regardless of the user's mana circle level, but its destructive power depends on the amount of mana used. A blazing fireball forms in Jeong's hand, and he hurls it forcefully toward Park and the monkeys chasing him. Park is stunned as he sees the fiery sphere resembling a meteor heading straight for him. At the last second, he leaps out of the way, narrowly avoiding the fireball. Catching his breath, he shakily asks Jeong what that was, wondering if it was magic. Everyone else is equally astonished by what they've just witnessed, questioning whether they too might be able to perform such feats. Jeong decides to leave the remaining monsters for the other players, giving them a chance to gain experience. Afterward, he uses the authority of gluttony on the corpses of the monkeys, gaining 3 points in agility, though it gradually decreases to 3/10. A notification appears, informing him that the hungry prince is completely satisfied with the perfectly cooked feast. Suddenly, Park kneels before Jeong and swears to serve him with his life from now on. Jeong smiles and responds, "If that's the case, please continue taking good care of me." Park is overjoyed and promises to do anything Jeong asks, urging him to just say the word. Jeong replies, "That's good. You can eat the banana now because you'll be doing a lot of running in the next round as well." Sometime later, deep in the forest, Jeong encounters a group of wild boars digging in the ground. They charge at him the moment they see him, but after taking them down, Jeong levels up to level 3. He's surprised by this, as he had expected to reach the next level only after the 5th wave, and wonders if it's due to the power of the authority of gluttony. At that moment, a message from the system informs him that the 3rd wave has ended, and all players have received 50 points as a reward. Jeong feels relieved knowing they succeeded, though he had taken down a large number of the monsters himself. He hadn't expected the others to finish off the remaining creatures so quickly. Looking at the leaderboard, he notices that Yu has moved up to 2nd place, surpassing Kang. Jeong believes this is due to the sword Yu acquired. Even though it was inexpensive, it clearly made a difference. Just then, a massive and enraged boar approaches Jeong. Turning to face it, Jeong calmly says, "So, you finally decided to show yourself." The boar lets out a powerful roar, recognized as the boss monster of the Boar Hill region. Jeong opens the Vault of Greed and retrieves a sharpness enchantment, developed in the colorless tower. This enchantment uses mana to enhance the sharpness of blades. Jeong imbues his sword with the enchantment, deciding to end the battle quickly since he doesn't have time for delays. The boar charges at Jeong, and he prepares to meet it head-on, channeling all his energy into his now sharpened sword. With a single enhanced strike, Jeong takes the boar down, earning 500 contribution points and receiving the giant boar's tusk. As a reward, Jeong examines the tusk curiously. Unlike the gray wolf pelt he had received earlier, this time he obtained a raw material that would need to be processed before it could be used. He decides to store the tusk for the time being. At that moment, Jeong is startled by a sudden bright light emanating from one of the holes the boars had dug. The light takes the form of an item called the Chosen One's Tool, a D-grade item used for refining swords. Jeong picks up the tool and wonders if this was what the boars were trying to find. Feeling a connection between the tool and his sword, he decides to explore its potential use later. Back at the players' camp, the others are busy tending to the wounded and gathering the corpses of the monsters they killed. Jeong finds a suitable spot and pulls out the sword and the refining tool he obtained. He opens the Vault of Greed once more and retrieves an item called the Black Rock Grinding Primer, a secret passed down to beginner dwarves in the Black Rock tribe, known for their exceptional craftsmanship skills. Jeong begins refining his sword using the tool and the primer he obtained, despite it being his first time attempting to forge a sword. As he becomes engrossed in the process, an elderly man approaches, expressing admiration for what Jeong is doing. Turning to face him, Jeong listens as the old man comments that most people use machines to polish swords these days, and that it's rare to see someone working by hand. Jeong asks if the old man has experience in the craft, and the man replies that he's been in the trade for decades. He examines the polishing stone and is impressed by its excellent condition, asking Jeong where he found such a high-quality stone in the wild. Jeong replies that he found it by chance and asks if the old man wouldn't mind helping him refine the sword. The old man laughs, saying he'd be happy to help. After inspecting the sword, he notes that despite the rust, it's of high quality. Jeong watches the old man work with great skill and experience, noticing how adept he is at polishing swords. After some time, the old man finishes polishing the sword and expresses joy, saying it's been a long time since he focused on a task like this. He hands the sword back to Jeong, who is astonished by the transformation. Jeong swings the sword and is surprised by how much lighter and more flexible it feels. Checking the system window, he sees that the sword's E grade has risen to D+, and its abilities have changed as well. The first new ability is Expert's Touch, which increases the sharpness of the sword by 20%. The second ability, Hero's Mark, now boosts attack power by 15%, up from 10%. Jeong praises the old man, expressing his admiration for the result. The old man chuckles and says, "Despite its simplicity, the sword is the most sensitive tool among what you possess." Jeong then asks if the old man could take care of his other equipment as well, noting that they could be even more useful if polished properly. At that moment, a system message appears, informing Jeong that the constellation Golden Crown Soldier is interested in the player Go Chang. Jeong is shocked to see this message because he knows that the Golden Crown Soldier is none other than Paris, the 28th demon lord of the 72 lords of hell, associated with the 7 deadly sins. Despite being known for his obsession with battles, Paris is highly skilled in alchemy and capable of turning metals into gold. His expertise with iron rivals the legendary Hephaestus of Olympus, though Paris focuses more on destructive power, while Hephaestus values balance. The weapons Paris forges are coveted even by the rulers. Jeong is stunned that the old man has attracted the attention of such a powerful constellation like Paris. As the old man looks at the system window, confused, Jeong explains that he has caught the eye of a high-ranking constellation. The old man, even more puzzled, asks what that means. Jeong explains that constellations are higher entities that reside on the upper floors of the tower. The old man, puzzled, asks why such a great entity would take interest in someone as simple as him, and he questions how Jeong knows all this. Jeong explains that he, too, had caught the attention of a constellation earlier. The old man grows a bit uneasy, asking if that means he will be required to perform certain tasks. Jeong reassures him that not all constellations are harmful, and that gaining the interest of one can be highly beneficial. Curious, the old man asks what kind of benefits he could expect, and Jeong smiles, telling him that the fireball he unleashed in the previous battle was thanks to one of the constellations. The old man, intrigued, grows excited at the thought. At that moment, Jeong extends his hand and asks the old man to continue taking care of his equipment. The old man shakes Jeong's hand with a smile, saying, "Don't worry. I'm far more confident in my ability to maintain equipment than I am at swinging a stick at monsters." Jeong smiles to himself, realizing that having a skilled craftsman like the old man on his side is a huge asset. It means he won't have to worry about equipment issues in the future. Afterward, Jeong opens the Vault of Greed and acquires the 3 Talents technique, a training method for unlocking the Dantian. Jeong begins meditating, thinking to himself that since he has already formed his mana circle, it's now time to open his Dantian. The mana circle is located in the heart, but the Dantian is unlocked in the lower abdomen. After intense concentration and using the 3 Talents technique, Jeong successfully unlocks his Dantian. The system informs him that he can now use internal energy, which will enhance the efficiency of his martial arts the more it grows. Jeong receives 1,000 contribution points as a reward for this achievement. When he opens his eyes, he realizes that only an hour remains before the next wave of monsters. At that moment, Jeong is surprised when the old man approaches, holding a dagger and smiling as he offers it to Jeong. Jeong is amazed by how quickly the old man had completed the task and thanks him. The old man remarks that the result could have been even better if he had the right equipment and asks Jeong to inspect the dagger and share his thoughts. And the tusk itself has been refined into a D+ grade dagger. The old man asks if Jeong is satisfied with the dagger. Jeong smiles and says it's incredible, admitting he never thought he'd obtain such a high-grade item without proper tools. Jeong praises the old man's skill, noting that it's no surprise someone who caught the attention of Paris would be this talented. The old man had even crafted a sheath for the dagger, and Jeong places the weapon in it, thanking him for his work. Jeong tells the old man that he believes it would be best if he stayed out of direct combat and focused on managing the camp's equipment. The old man agrees, saying he doesn't mind at all. Jeong adds that this would benefit everyone, especially since the upcoming wave would be intense. As time passes, the 4th wave approaches. Yu shouts for everyone to prepare, reminding them, based on Jeong's warning, that this wave would be particularly dangerous. However, many players don't seem to take her seriously, chatting and distracted by side conversations. Yu grows increasingly nervous, noticing their overconfidence, and is certain the wave won't be easy if Jeong had warned them. Suddenly, everyone hears a loud crashing sound. When Yu looks over, she sees that Kang has slammed his fist into the ground with tremendous force. With a sharp look, he orders everyone to be quiet, causing them all to tense up and feel a deep sense of fear. Yu resumes speaking, informing them that there's only 1 minute left and that they need to be ready. She thanks Kang for his intervention, but he turns his head away and sighs without saying a word. The fourth wave begins, and the monsters start to appear. The players are surprised to see that the wave consists of wolves once again, and they think it will be easy. However, their confidence fades as the wolves approach, and they realize these wolves are far larger than before. Park, feeling scared, asks Jeong if this is normal. Jeong coldly responds by asking if Park expected to face sheep. Jeong glances at the players' anxious faces, recalling how he used to be just like them when facing large beasts. However, he notices that Kang and Yu stand out, thinking that they are completely different from the others. Jeong tells Park to stop talking and start hunting. Park, visibly nervous, replies, "Okay," though he clearly feels uneasy. When Jeong asks if he has any objections, Park, trembling, quickly complies while on the verge of tears. Park rushes off, leading a large pack of gray wolves behind him, screaming to Jeong for help, claiming the situation is far too dangerous this time. Jeong, remaining cold, tells Park to stop exaggerating as he prepares his fire attack. Jeong launches the fire attack at Park and the wolves chasing him. Park, startled, yells out, saying that Jeong didn't even warn him this time. The fire attack hits several gray wolves, and a system window informs Jeong that the hungry prince grabbed his utensils quickly, watching the meal as it cooked. Some of the gray wolves manage to dodge Jeong's attack, so he draws his sword and declares that he'll fight them on their terms. Jeong opens the Vault of Greed and retrieves the Blood Wolf Sword art. He charges forward with incredible speed and strikes using the first formation of the sword art, Wolf Claw, swiftly taking down one of the wolves. As he taps into his internal energy and opens his dantian, Jeong feels the power of his martial arts intensify. The system informs him that all his physical abilities have increased with the use of his internal energy, and the One Blood Wolf sword art has been significantly enhanced. Jeong appears completely different, moving at astonishing speed toward the attacking wolves, eliminating them all in mere moments. Park, extremely shaken, asks if Jeong is the same person he used to know. Jeong coldly responds, "Stop acting dumb." He then uses the authority of gluttony on the gray wolf corpses, gaining 1 point in strength and 3 points in agility, though they quickly decrease to 1/10 and 3/10. A system window appears, informing Jeong that the hungry prince Gend is very pleased with the feast. Park approaches Jeong, asking what he thinks about not helping the other players, pointing out their struggles. Jeong glances at the players who are struggling against the monsters. Even Yu and Kang seem exhausted. Kang is having difficulty keeping up with the speed of the massive wolves, and Yu looks fatigued despite her best efforts to hold on. As Jeong focuses on Yu, he notices something strange. A window appears, informing him that the Crowned Spider, a high-ranking constellation, is observing Yu's swordsmanship with great interest. Jeong is taken aback, realizing that the Crowned Spider, also known as Baal, is the strongest of the 72 demon lords. While Baal may not be a demonic ruler like the Hungry Prince or the Bent Raven, he is a master swordsman and the leader of the Con 66 Demon Union. Jeong understands that this is the reason why the Crowned Spider is so interested in Yu. At that moment, Yu feels something strange and sees a window appear before her, informing her that the Crowned Spider wishes to test her abilities.
Meanwhile, seeing her fighting with the wolves, Jeong thinks the speed of the swinging sword was incomparable. Even though she held only one sword, it looked as if she was striking with multiple blades at once. That's Baal's power. Is he testing if Yu Seoa is worthy of his power? After that, Seoa kills the whole pack of the wolves, and then suddenly the notification bar comes in which it's written the constellation, Crowned Spider, raises its front legs in delight. After reading that, Jeong thinks seems Baal is quite pleased. Then suddenly many notification comes one by one in front of his eyes, in which it's written the tutorial chapter 1 adaptation. You have successfully cleared the fourth wave. All participants are awarded 100 points. Calculating personal contribution: first place, Jeong Sewoon 4,920 points. Second place, Yu Seoa 900 points. Third place, Hang Han Chul 580 points. After which Seo suddenly becomes unconscious but Jung stops her from falling down. And while looking at her he smiles and says good job. Meanwhile many people get injured after fighting with the wolves. And out of the frustration and anger they start talking that if only that guy had helped, he just stood watching, not lifting a finger. After that Jung puts Seo down and goes towards them, and while looking at him a guy asks him, what are you trying to do? You didn't even help us. Then Jung tells him to move. After which Jung unlocks the treasure vault of greed. And uses Cure Light, a basic healing spell from the White Tower, which stops bleeding and alleviates pain. After seeing him healing people, a girl asks him that please, can you help over here too? Then he replies, I can't use it too much. And I'll pick out only those WHO are in critical condition. Meanwhile later Jung thinks it's more than enough. It's beyond what I expected. There was no death, and the seriously injured will recover quickly with magic. After that he suddenly notices something and sees Han Chul standing in front of him. Then Jung asks him what's going on. After which he replies, fight me. Then Jung smiles and thinks typical Kong Han Chul. If I want to talk to him, I'll need to break his spirit first. After thinking all that he replies, alright, let's fight. Then Han Chul tells him, pick up your weapon. Use your magic, too. After which Jung replies, no need. And tells him that if you want me to pick up a weapon, then defeat me barehanded first. After listening to him Han Chul angrily replies fine and moves towards him to attack him. Then while looking at Han Chul fighting style, Jung thinks his attacks are powerful, but his defense has openings. After that he kicks on his leg and thinks his hardware is impressive, at least. Then Han Chul tries to punch him but he dodges it. After dodging that punch Jung thinks there's no way I can take on Kong Han Chul barehanded as I am now. After thinking all that he unlocks the treasure vault of greed and uses a fighting style named Tai Chi, a martial art developed in the southern schools of China. Alongside Shaolin Kung Fu, as one of the two major forms of Chinese martial arts. Then Han Chul tries to punch him again but Jung stops his punch by using his bare hand. And after that by using Tai Chi he pushes Han Chul away. After that Han Chul gets up and says it's not over yet. Meanwhile looking at his strength Jung thinks in terms of raw strength, Kong Han Chul is a step ahead, but the secret of Tai Chi isn't about brute force, but about controlling the surrounding energy at will. An attack that relies only on force, in front of Tai Chi will only end up harming the attacker. Meanwhile because of that powerful push given by Jung to Han Chul his shoulder dislocates and falls back towards the tree, and the push was so strong that even the tree also breaks. After which Han Chul looks at his shoulder and tells Jung that I've lost. Then Jung uses his Cure Light ability to heal Han Chul's shoulder. Meanwhile healing his shoulder Jung tells him that there's no need to rush. You're already strong enough. Twice a day, you'll spar with me here. After saying all that Jung moves his hand towards him to pick him up. Then Jung sees a notification in which it's written that the constellation, Old Man Riding a Crocodile, looks down intently at player Kong Han Chul. After reading it Jung thinks the old man on the crocodile Agaras, the second-ranked demon king. Looks like Kong Han Chul has finally caught the attention of a constellation. After that again a notification comes in which it's written that tutorial, Chapter 1 Adaption, the 5th wave begins. Defeats the monster wave and proves your worth. After that everyone gets ready for the next wave. And while looking at their confidence Jung thinks the people's attitudes have shifted a lot. Wolves, boars, monkeys, what's next? After that they see a herd of wild boars coming towards them to attack them. Then while looking at this Seo tells everyone that grip your weapons tight. Meanwhile a guy asks Jung that I'm all set. What are we dealing with? Then Jung replies no, this time you're off the hook. After replying him Jung thinks up until now, I've been holding back. Handling most of the enemies to match the others' skill levels. But it seems I no longer need to. And besides, everyone needs to earn their own contribution points as for Kong Han Chul. After thinking all that he sees Han Chul fighting with the wild boars and while seeing the fighting technique of Han Chul. Jung thinks wow, did you use Tai Chi technique? You've finished your contract with Agares, huh? Your strength has multiplied at this rate. After thinking all that Jung says I don't even need to get involved, DOI. Then the guy standing next to him angrily asks him what, and suddenly changes his tone and again asks Jung where are you going? And tells him that I'll go with you. After which Jung replies no need. And tells him that I'm climbing that rocky mountain over there. Then after looking at the height of the mountain he gets scared and tells him safe travels. I'll guard the camp. Meanwhile, on his way to that mountain, suddenly some wild monkeys attack him, but he kills them by using his sword. After which suddenly the notification starts coming in front of him, in which it's written that through internal energy, the Blood Wolf Sword Technique's second move, Blood Wolf Fang, is enhanced. The constellation, Hungry Prince, mutters that a barbecue party wasn't enough to fill him up. After reading that, he says, "Don't worry, I'll make sure you're well fed." Then he thinks honestly, dealing with you feels like taking care of a child. Or maybe a hungry pet is more fitting. Don't worry, at the summit, there's something tastier than what you've had so far. Before the regression, I wouldn't have even dared to explore this terrain. But now, it's different. After that, he opens the Vault of Greed and uses the Balaton Cliff's macaque ability, a top predator living among the Rocky Mountains and cliffs. Then after using that ability, he thinks, with this power, there's no way I can't climb. Meanwhile, a few minutes later, while climbing, he thinks, I know where to place my hands, how to handle the wind. The monkey's instincts are flowing through me. Without this strength, I would have fallen long ago. Then suddenly a notification comes in front of him, in which it's written that the constellation, Hungry Prince, wonders where the food is. In a place like this. After reading it, he says, well, it's about time something showed up. Then later, while looking at a human at that height, the monkeys get shocked. And while noticing that, Jeong thinks seems like they were pretty startled. Well, who'd expect anyone to climb up this far? After that, the monkeys try to attack him, so he falls down from the mountain, but he dodges them by jumping up and suddenly takes out his sword. And protects himself from falling by using his sword. At this moment, he thinks maybe one attempt wasn't enough. After that, he looks at a cave and says that cave looks like it's the path the monkeys use. Well then, let's see, shall I search for a hidden piece? Meanwhile, later, after eliminating the monkeys from the mountain, he reaches the cave. And says, as expected, this cave connects to the summit after all. After which he sees a big white monkey coming towards him to attack him. And while looking at him, he smiles and says, so, you're the leader.
What gonna happen next? To find out, do like, share, and comment if you want the next part as soon as possible. And also help us by giving supers, because your support motivates us a lot to make such type of content. Thanks for watching, sayonara.
The protagonist fought with the white monkey holding a sword in front of him, while the monkey tried to attack him from different directions. The protagonist defended himself from these attacks with a tense expression on his face, protecting his body with a sword, looking at the white monkey Sewoon and thinking that for a boss monster in training, his weapon skills are quite impressive. At this time, the white monkey with brightly glowing red eyes opened its mouth wide again, preparing a new attack. The protagonist thought that if he continues to defend himself, he will be at a disadvantage. He raised his sword above his head to defend himself from the white monkey's new attack. After another powerful attack with a stick from the white monkey, Sewoon stepped back and put his sword back in its sheath. The white monkey looked at him in bewilderment. The protagonist understood that he needed to attack and at the same time minimize the damage he received. After that, Sewoon began to approach the white monkey with rapid jerking movements. He grabbed the stick that the white monkey was wielding in his hand. Then Sewoon, with a concentrated expression on his face, squeezing this stick, approached the white monkey even closer, and then attacked with a direct blow of his foot. The monkey screamed furiously at him, Sewoon pressing the white monkey to the floor with his foot, mentally cursed, realizing that it was difficult. After that, Sewoon managed to throw the white monkey back with a thrusting movement of his foot, which caused the monkey to fly back several meters with a loud scream. The main character, holding the stick that belonged to the monkey in his hand, exhaled heavily from his lungs. Looking at this stick, he thought that this thing was heavier than he thought. The white monkey, filled with rage, looked at Sewoon and screamed loudly. The main character, turning to the white monkey, asked if it wanted to return it. After that, the system window notified Sewoon that the greed storage had been opened. From the greed storage, Sewoon took out the dog beating staff technique, a secret technique of the open gate sect that was created to scare away mad dogs that threaten beggars. After using this skill, Sewoon stood in a fighting stance, clutching a long stick in his hands. The white monkey looked at him in bewilderment with a confused face. The protagonist confidently looked in front of him at the white monkey and said that this would not happen. Sometime after that, on the top of a high cliff, Sewoon made a sharp blow from top to bottom with a long stick, thereby hitting the white monkey on the skull. A notification appeared on the system window that informed Sewoon that he had defeated the boss monster from the monkey cliff. This monkey was called the Cliff Climber. The protagonist stood next to the fallen body of the white monkey, confidently looking ahead and holding the weapon he had taken from the monkey in his hand. The system window informed Sewoon that his level had increased and his personal merit points had increased by 1,000 points, after which the system window informed Sewoon that he had received the Monkey Mountain Hazelnut Stone. This stone was glowing and levitating in the air near Sewoon. The protagonist, looking at this, asked again, "A hazelnut stone?" Then he decided that he would give it to Chang-suk later, thinking that this stone would be useful for something. Then Sewoon, releasing the jaws of the hungry prince, apologized for the wait. The system window informed Sewoon that he had eaten the monkey that was climbing the rocks. The jaws of the hungry prince greedily sank their fangs into the white monkey's pipe. The system window said that the absorption of nutrients increased agility by 5 and intelligence by 5. The protagonist thoughtfully looked ahead with his arms crossed over his chest and thought about how he had acquired 10 stats at once. The protagonist reasoned that all this was due to the fact that the power of greed was so strong, but the power of the devourer was also insanely good, and at this rate, turning into a tank seemed inevitable to him. Summing up, Sewoon looked ahead and said that he needed to see what the monkey was guarding. At that moment Sewoon looked deep into the rock. He grabbed a stone with his hand that stood out from the general background. After that, Sewoon managed to move this large stone, and he saw that behind this stone there was a passage inside. The system window informed Sewoon that he had discovered a hidden dungeon called the Training Ground of the Forgotten Hero. The protagonist looked at the dark space inside the rock and went in that direction. With a smile looking ahead, Sewoon noticed that this cannot be. After that he asked out loud, "In the first chapter of the tutorial, is there a dungeon?" Sewoon reasoned that the dungeon means that he can get much more experience than on ordinary battlefields, and passing this gives incredible rewards, especially if you pass it first, then the reward will multiply several times. The protagonist decided that he should not hesitate to go all this way. After that Sewoon went inside the room. The system window informed him that the storage of greed was opened. Sewoon activated the eyes of the night owl, after which his eyes began to glow a bright purple color. The system window explained that the eyes of the night owl are the eyes of a nocturnal predator known as a night owl, and these collect light even in complete darkness, thereby illuminating his vision. The protagonist suggested going, then headed deeper into the space that he had recently discovered. Walking through a narrow rocky room, Sewoon saw many bats that were on the ceiling of this room. The protagonist held his hand out in front of him as the bats flew over his head. He thought that from the entrance until now it had been a constant downward slope, and since this cave was drilled into the mountain it should be closer to the bottom the deeper he went. Soon after, Sewoon looked ahead in surprise. He said that here, in front of Sewoon, was a tall cave with a large stone pillar in the center. Looking around this room, Sewoon noticed a large number of different swords that were stuck into the rocky bedrock of the cliff. The protagonist, looking at this, said that the walls and floor were torn by traces of piercing objects. He noticed that it almost scared him, and this place really was worthy of being called a training ground. Then Sewoon again looked in surprise at something that was in front of him. He noticed that it was a hole. The protagonist saw how in the rocky bedrock of the cave there was something golden in color. With a smile on his face looking at this, Sewoon noted that as expected this was part of the quest chain. After that, Sewoon began to take out his sword from its sheath. An inscription appeared on the system window, "The Sword of the Forgotten Hero." The protagonist, using the sword with a straight thrust the sword into the golden space in the rock. A bright golden light began to emanate from this space. An inscription appeared on the system window which informed Sewoon that he had earned the right to challenge the Forgotten Hero. A passage appeared in front of Sewoon that glowed with a bright golden color. The protagonist closed his eyes from such a blinding light. Suddenly, Sewoon looked ahead in surprise, while behind him was a certain person in voluminous armor in the form of a spirit. This spirit abruptly took his hand in which was the sword and stood up. The protagonist, looking at this in surprise, cursed, thinking that it had really already begun. The protagonist looked down in fear. He noticed that the sword of the Forgotten Hero which he thrust into the golden space was not available. A notification appeared on the system window that the trial of the Forgotten Hero had begun, and no other weapon could be used except the broken sword. Then a warning appeared on the system window that the use of magic was prohibited. The protagonist grinned, looking ahead, and assumed that this meant that he could not use his normal equipment, or magic. The system window informed him that after he grabbed the broken sword, the battle with the Forgotten Hero would begin. The protagonist walked forward through the space that was filled with swords stuck in stones. The protagonist took the first sword he came across in his hand, the blade of which had many cracks, and confidently looked ahead from under his brows. The blue spirit looked back at him emotionlessly. After that, this spirit, with a sharp movement of his hand, extended one hand in front of himself, and prepared the other hand with the sword for a strike. A moment after that, the spirit struck. Sewoon defended himself from this blow by holding the sword in front of him. Then the spirit with a smile on his face said that no one had challenged him for a long time. The protagonist defended himself from this blow by throwing the spirit's hand back. The spirit retreated while Sewoon looked at him intently and asked him again, "How long ago?" Sewoon then assumed that this meant that there were already other rivals in his house. The spirit looked at Sewoon intently and answered him affirmatively, saying that he had been alone for a very long time. The protagonist with a smile on his face assumed that since he was still there, he must have failed. Then Sewoon asked him if that was true. The spirit responded by making several more quick attacks on Sewoon. The protagonist defended himself from each of these attacks by holding his sword in front of him. After a short time, many deep cracks appeared on the sword, and after a moment, his sword broke into many pieces. The protagonist with a confused expression looked at the stump of his sword that he was holding in his hands. The spirit with a confident smile on his face responded to him by saying that this was true. After that, the spirit tried to attack Sewoon again and again. Sewoon managed to dodge these attacks. The spirit excitedly approached him quickly, raising the sword for new attacks. The protagonist held another sword in front of himself, but the spirit with a blow of his sword cut Sewoon's sword in half, causing the blade of his sword to fly several meters away. The spirit looking at Sewoon said that his reaction is normal, but his movements are slow. He noticed that this is strange. Then the spirit said that he has experience, but his body cannot keep up with this experience. The protagonist looked at him with a surprised expression. Sewoon thought that he realized this after crossing blades several times. After that, Sewoon addressed him as a hero and told him that he uses the energy of the sword in training. Then he asked him, is he going to let him pass this test at all? The spirit with a smile on his face looking at him asked him if he noticed the energy of the sword. Sewoon looking at him thought that this is why no one could pass this test. He assumed that it is simply almost impossible to find this place. The spirit addressing him said that if he cannot pass even this, it is better for him not to pass at all. After that, the spirit carefully looking at Sewoon with his glowing eyes rushed to the attack and made a sharp sweeping blow throwing Sewoon back. The protagonist got to his feet and carefully looked at his opponent. The spirit asked him how long is he going to dodge? Then he explained to him that he was not a monster and he was not going to continue attacking in the same way. The protagonist looked at him and took another sword in his hand and thought that he was right, and with ordinary monsters it was easy enough to understand how they attack, but not with him. Sewoon realized that if he dodged, he could receive serious damage. He thought about what if he could neither dodge nor block. The protagonist began to move forward. He opened the storage of greed and took out a Taiji sword from there. The sword that Sewoon held in his hands began to glow with magical energy. A notification appeared on the system window that the basic sword technique of the Wudang sect embodies the secret Taiji as Taijiquan. Then Sewoon mentally decided to counterattack. At that moment, when the spirit made a new sweeping movement with his sword, Sewoon responded by making a counterstrike. The spirit looked ahead in surprise at that moment when their sword blades were crossed. Then the spirit with a sharp movement of his hand threw Sewoon's sword aside. He said that it was a good move, but it was not enough. After that, the spirit looked in surprise as Sewoon approached him holding another sword in his hands. The protagonist used the third position of the Blood Wolf sword technique called the Blood Wolf attack. At that moment, he was able to knock the spirit's sword out of his hands. The spirit continued to stand there clutching the stump of the sword in his hands. Looking at this, the spirit said that this was impressive and he predicted 2 steps ahead. Then the spirit said that such a technique would not be possible without a lot of experience. He asked Sewoon if he hid his power? Then he explained his question by saying that he did not see any signs that he had studied the soft sword technique. The protagonist stood in a fighting stance opposite him, stretching out the sword in front of him and raising his other hand above his head. The protagonist thought that this was natural, since he had just opened the treasure vault and gained this power a few minutes ago. Then Sewoon thought about the fact that for those who do not know about power, it must look like he was hiding his power. Then looking at the sword that was lying on the floor, he asked how this test would end. The spirit answered him that naturally he would pass, because in the end he disarmed him. After that, the spirit spread his arms to the sides and said that with such potential. The protagonist looked ahead in surprise, noticing that something behind him was glowing with a bright golden color. The spirit said that he doubted that anyone would be able to take the sword away from him. The protagonist turned to the golden space in the column that was in the center of the room. Looking at this, Sewoon assumed that this must be the power that the Forgotten Hero had been guarding all this time and the reward of the Forgotten Hero's training ground. After that, Sewoon grabbed the sword that he had inserted into the rock some time ago with his hands. Suddenly his face changed. He stood tensely clutching the hilt of the sword. The spirit ordered him to be patient. He explained to him that the sword recognized him as its owner. The protagonist turned to look at him, and then looked at the sword with a smirk on his face and mentally repeated these words, "A sword that recognizes its owner." The protagonist decided that this was undoubtedly at least rank A. Then, straining his body more and more, he thought about how he could endure and hold on, and ultimately, in his past life, he reached the 92nd floor of the tower without any talent. Sewoon's entire body was tense, blood began to drip from his mouth. The protagonist clenched his jaw in incredible tension while looking ahead. Soon he was able to pull out the sword. He looked at it in surprise and then raising the sword above his head noticed that the sword that he stuck in the rock and which he pulled out was very different in appearance. The protagonist said that this was the true form of the forgotten hero's sword. The spirit suggested that it seemed that he was still fighting with it now, but he told him that this sword would soon accept him. Then the spirit said out loud that he hoped that in the future it would show him something even greater. After that, the spirit disappeared and a notification appeared on the system window that he had perfectly completed the hidden dungeon called the training ground of the forgotten hero. The protagonist suddenly squatted down clutching the sword in his hands, then he fell to the ground with his arms and legs wide apart, still holding the sword in his hand. A message appeared on the system window stating that his level had increased and he had accomplished a historic feat. As a reward for this, his personal merit points increased by 20,000. After that, the system window informed him that he had received the sword of the forgotten hero, which is called the sword that cut the rock Durandal. Soon, a message appeared on the system window stating that the constellation of the bowed raven jumped up from its place. At this time, white monkeys loudly screamed and attacked the players. A message appeared on the system window warning that the sixth wave was beginning and the system window ordered the players to stop the wave of monsters and prove their existence. Seoa, with a concentrated expression on her face, used her sword to cut the bodies of the white monkeys. After that, she put her hand in front of her and ordered everyone to keep in line and said that they have the advantage. Then she shouted loudly that they have nothing to fear. Hanchiol hit the white monkey attacking him with his fist. He began to press the white monkey into the ground with his fists. Then he frowned and looked ahead. Seoa walked up to him and with a worried expression said that Sewoon had not been seen for a long time. She asked if something had happened to him. Hanchiol looked at her and then frowned and looked ahead. Seoa turned to Hanchiol again and put her hand in front of her, said that she could not wait any longer and that she would go look for Sewoon. Hanchiol crossed his arms over his chest and looked at her. Seoa asked him if he would go with her when the wave ended. Hanchiol told her that there was no need. Seoa asked him in confusion, "Is he not worried?" Then she shouted that they are already without Sewoon. She did not have time to finish because Hanchiol interrupted her, saying that he is not so weak that they should worry about him. Seoa looked ahead with a surprised expression. Hanchiol told her that right now he is probably doing something that they could not even imagine. On the system window that was located above their heads it was written that Sewoon was in first place, and he had 28,660 points. Seoa was in second place, and she had 1680 points, and Hanchiol was in third place, and he had 1,600 points. They looked at this system window. Hanchiol explained to her that based on this they should continue to hold back the waves and become stronger until he returns. Seoa looked at the system window with a smile on her face and agreed with him. Some time after that, Sewoon, lying on the floor, looked around and asked himself, did he disappear right after he pulled out the sword? Sewoon cursed mentally, thinking that all his internal energy and mana were completely depleted. He stood up with his hands on the rocks and thought that he really wanted to test the characteristics of the sword, but he knew that he had to fill his dantian first. Sewoon then sat in a meditative pose with his legs crossed underneath him and his hands on his hips. Blue magical energy began to appear around him. After a while, Sewoon paused and looked in front of him in surprise. He asked himself in confusion, "What is this?" He then turned around and saw that there was a powerful stream of blue energy behind him. The protagonist guessed that it seemed that the reward in this dungeon was not only the sword. The system window notified Sewoon that the greed storage was opened. The protagonist used the Dark Mana Circle, which was a method of teaching the Dark Mana Circle, which is said to be passed on only to direct disciples in the Black Tower and the House of Dark Magicians. The protagonist began to use the most powerful cardio training. The system window reported that this is a secret technique of the heart that has been passed down from generation to generation in the clan of magicians. The protagonist, with a smirk on his face, confidently looked ahead and said that in this case, he will drain Leylin until it is completely dry. Soon after, the entire cave was illuminated with a bright blue color. The protagonist sat in the center of the room surrounded by swords that were stuck into the stones. He sat in a meditation pose with his hands on his hips and his legs crossed under him. His cloak fluttered behind him and Sewoon himself at that moment evenly inhaled and exhaled air from his lungs. Notifications appeared on the system window. The first notification informed Sewoon that he successfully completed the 6th wave of the first chapter's training called Adaptation. The system window also informed him that he successfully completed the 7th wave and the 8th wave too. The protagonist looked at these system window notifications that appeared again and again with a surprised expression and asked, "Has it really been that long?" He thought about the fact that it had been a day and a half since he left the camp. A new system window notified Sewoon that all wave participants received 200 points. The protagonist thought that he was glad that they lasted without him. He understood that the last test of the first chapter was the 10th wave, and as expected from the last wave, the level of monsters would increase sharply. The protagonist leaned on his knees and stood up, assuming that it looked like he would have to earn a living in the camp for some time. A new system window appeared in front of Sewoon's face, which said that thanks to the most powerful cardio training, he had accumulated half of the jade of internal energy in his dantian, and all the martial arts he uses will have increased efficiency and destructive power. The protagonist examined his palms while his entire body was surrounded by blue magical energy. A message appeared on the system window that said that thanks to the Black Tower's training method, he had formed a second mana circle and could now use the magic of the second circle, and the strength and power of his magic had increased. The protagonist looked at his blue glowing palm and thought that growing so much in less than 2 days was unbelievable. Then he thought about what was even more important. A notification appeared on the newly appeared system window that informed Sewoon that the sword that cut the rock called Durandal had been sealed. A luxurious sword glowing with bright magical energy was described on the system window. Inside this system window it was said that the category of this sword was a long sword. The rank of this sword was B. In the description of Durandal it was said that it was a legendary sword that was used by legendary heroes, and the potential of this sword was still sealed because it had not fully realized the power of its owner. The protagonist holding Durandal in his hands and looking at it said that he could not believe that this sword was hidden in the first chapter of the training. Looking ahead, Sewoon thought that even before his regression, the existence of this sword was only rumored, but it was never found. Then Sewoon, squeezing the handle of Durandal in his hand, made a sharp movement with this sword, cutting the air in front of him. Following the movement of Durandal, a stream of magical energy remained in the air. The protagonist with a grin on his face looking at Durandal in surprise said that even with the sealed power, it is still incredibly strong. Mentally, Sewoon assumed that perhaps the reason why the seal was not completely removed is because his current strength is not enough. A system window appeared in front of Sewoon's face and notified him that the time remaining until the 9th wave of monsters within the first chapter of the training called Adaptation is 24 minutes. The main character, putting Durandal in its sheath, cursed, realizing that he needed to hurry. After that, he quickly ran towards the exit of the cave, from where the street sunlight illuminated the space inside the cave. By this time, in the players' camp, a monkey with red fur furiously attacked the players with an iron axe. This red monkey screamed loudly, trying to break the wooden shield with which the player defended himself from the monkey's attack with his axe. At this time, one of the girls of the players with a worried expression on her face turned to the others, asking them to hold the line. After that, she shouted again for them to hold. At that moment, she stood next to the wounded girl, while around them there was a battle between the players and the monkeys, who were armed with various melee weapons from spears to swords. The player who was near them and protected them with a shield from the attacks of the monkeys screamed that they can't because there are too many monkeys. After that, the girl asked them, "What about the wounded?" One of the guys cursed and shouted back at her that they had no time to worry about the wounded. One of the red monkeys was jumping towards Seoa with its mouth wide open and bloodthirsty eyes. Seoa looked at the monkey approaching her with wide open eyes. After that, she delivered several sharp and clear blows to the monkey, cutting the monkey's chest and limbs with the blade of her sword. The system window notified Seoa that the crowned spider constellation had corrected Seoa's player's pose, telling her that her movements lacked grace. Seoa looked at this system window in confusion and asked in bewilderment, "Is it really now?" After that, Seoa began to reason that starting from the 7th wave, the monsters became noticeably stronger. She was having a hard time catching her breath, actively inhaling air into her lungs. She looked around with a frown and thought that there were a lot of wounded. Then she asked herself, would they be able to stand up? Suddenly, another red monkey approached her from behind. Seoa worriedly tried to turn towards this monkey to defend herself from the attack, But suddenly her body stopped obeying her. Her hand was shaking while clutching the sword. Seoa, looking at this with fear, thought that her hand. At that moment, Hancheol stuck his hands into the dense soil, breaking it into pieces. After that, he threw huge dense stone pieces towards the monkeys, thereby knocking over several of them. A notification appeared on the system window, informing Hancheol that the constellation Old Man on the Crocodile was looking at the shaking earth with satisfied eyes. Another system window reported that the Crowned Spider constellation was baring its fangs, ordering the Old Man on the Crocodile not to interfere. Seoa, with a confused expression on her face, sitting on the ground and holding a sword in her hand, thanked Hancheol for his help. Hancheol responded by advising her to transfer the two. Seoa, frowning, looked at him and noticed that they were wounded. Hancheol, frowning, looked at her and explained to her that if she fell while protecting them, the entire camp would be destroyed. Seoa, looking at Hancheol's trail, thought that he was also seriously injured. Seoa reasoned that if Sewoon did not come, it would be the end for them. Then, with a surprised expression on her face, she opened her eyes wide and heard someone's loud, terrified scream. It was Youngpil who, with tears in his eyes, holding bananas in his hand, ran away in horror from the red monkeys chasing him, screaming that they were at their limit, and he could not hold on any longer. He waved his arms in fear and swore, asking where Sewoon was now. While running, Youngpil tripped over a stone ledge and began to fall to the ground, dropping the bananas from his hands. The red monkeys excitedly began to stretch their paws towards Youngpil, opening their mouths with long fangs wide. Youngpil looked in horror at the monkeys approaching him, tears streaming down his cheeks. He put his hands in front of his face, making painful sounds. Suddenly, the three monkeys that approached Youngpil were simultaneously struck by an electric discharge that immobilized them. After that, a notification appeared on the system window that the Crowned Spider constellation bowed its head to the demon god. Seoa looked ahead in bewilderment, her eyes and mouth wide open. Then another notification appeared on the system window that reported that the Old Man on the Crocodile constellation also bowed its head to the demon god. Hancheol turned around with a surprised expression, his mouth slightly open. The monkeys were burned to death by the electric discharge that struck them. The bodies of the red monkeys stopped sparking and thick black smoke began to come out of their burnt fur. The protagonist stood surrounded by blue magical energy with a gloomy expression, holding his hand out in front of him and directing electric discharges towards the red monkeys that had not yet been defeated by him. Youngpil, touched, with a smile on his face, addressed Sewoon as a brother. Then the players started shouting, "Sewoon!" Sewoon looked ahead with an unperturbed expression and held his palm out in front of him. The system window notified him that the greed vault had been opened. The protagonist looked at his palm, which was concentrating the magical energy of lightning, and cast a chain lightning spell, after which he defeated several more puzzled monkeys with an electric discharge, causing the fur of these monkeys to rise and the red monkeys themselves to scream in pain. Looking at this, the protagonist thought that this was more dangerous than he thought. Then Sewoon looked to the side and noticed that it seemed like Seoa and Hancheol were holding up well, however. He watched Seoa, with a smile on his face, and Hancheol, with a displeased expression, watched Youngpil, who enthusiastically raised his hands high above his head and moved his whole body expressively while loudly shouting the name, Sewoon. The protagonist looked at Youngpil warily and asked himself, "What is this guy doing there?" A notification appeared on the system window that the Cheerful Donkey Head constellation was laughing and pointing at the player Youngpil. The Cheerful Donkey Head constellation was above Youngpil's head and laughed loudly at Youngpil's behavior. The protagonist noticed that, moreover, Youngpil even attracted the constellation's attention. The other players noticed this magic with surprised expressions, then they asked in bewilderment, "Could this be?" Another player shouted with a smile on his face, "He is here!" After that, he solemnly announced that this person is here. The players happily shouted that it is a bloody wolf. Sewoon, warming his wrists, watched the players, then he asked, "A bloody wolf?" Youngpil, with a smile on his face, pointed his fingers at Sewoon, asked him if he liked the nickname he gave him. Then Youngpil clenched his fists in joy and shouted about the scent of blood spreading with every swing of the sword with the wolfskin cloak. After that, he asked, "Isn't it wonderful?" Sewoon looked at Youngpil calmly. He thought that the title for the player is as important as the name, and it will be called more often. Then Sewoon, with an irritated expression and swollen veins on his face, looked in front of him, clutching his wolfskin jacket with a shaking hand. The protagonist thought with disappointment that, in addition, someone like Youngpil gave him a nickname so rashly. Then Sewoon angrily told Youngpil that he would make sure that he was the one to give him the title. A notification appeared on the system window which informed that he had successfully passed the 9th wave within the first chapter of the training called Adaptation. Young-pil asked him again in confusion, and then joyfully shouted that it was a great honor, and he would be looking forward to this event with impatience. After that, he again joyfully shouted the name of his savior, Sewoon. And then notifications appeared on the system window that he had successfully passed the 9th wave, and each participant in the wave received 200 points. Then, at the top of the system window, information was displayed about the first place that Sewoon took as the owner of 41,660 points. In second place was Seoa with 4,820 points. In third place was Hancheol, who had 4,760 points. The main character raised his head and looked at the system window. Soon after, Seoa ran up to him from behind, loudly calling his name, holding a sword in her hand, followed by Hancheol. Hancheol looked at him and shouted that he was back. Seoa with wide open eyes asked him where he had disappeared to. After that, she shouted expressively to him that she was very worried. Sewoon, looking at the battlefield where there were many wounded players who were bleeding lying on the ground, answered her that he would explain to her later, but for now she should focus on taking care of the camp. Seoa asked him again in confusion, and then took a deep breath of air from her lungs. She ran away from him with a serious look, looking at him, and shouting to him that he would definitely explain later. Sewoon, looking at her with a smile on his face, noticed that for now Seoa is the leader of this camp. Hancheol, looking down at Sewoon, told him that he has become stronger than before. Then Hancheol, with his characteristic menacing expression, offered to meet him later at the old broken tree. Then Hancheol walked in the opposite direction from Sewoon. Sewoon, looking after him, mentally asked himself, "At the tree?" After that, Sewoon assumed that he was talking about a duel. The protagonist, looking after Hancheol, who was leaving him, thought that they had not had a duel for a long time. Then, crossing his arms over his chest and looking ahead, Sewoon said, "Young-pil." Young-pil instantly appeared next to Sewoon and, putting his hand to his temple, thereby saluting Sewoon, Young-pil submissively listened to him. The protagonist ordered him to report the situation. Young-pil, rubbing his palms, shouted to him satisfactorily and said that after he went to the Rocky Mountain, the 6th wave ended without incident. After that, Young-pil, with a smile on his face, noticed that, however, starting with the 7th wave. The protagonist looked in surprise at Young-pil, who was giving him the report, and asked himself in confusion, did this guy have such talent? Looking at how eloquently Young-pil talks about the events that happened during his absence, Sewoon thought that he remembered how Young-pil in every possible way imposed himself on Hancheol and caused inconvenience before the regression, but now Sewoon noticed that his memory and briefing skills are quite competent. Then Sewoon suggested that it seems that he is worthy of interest from the demon lords of the 6th rank, namely Veilfor. Veilfor at this moment watched Young-pil with interest, listening to what and how he tells. After that, Young-pil raised his index finger up and told Sewoon that in the remaining time, the twins set up wooden barricades. The protagonist repeated, "Wooden barricades." After that, he turned his gaze to the side and thought about what, however. After that, Sewoon asked, "However, there were no twins here, right?" Sometime after these events, 2 chopped logs lay on the short green grass. One of the twin sisters said that it looked like this place was enough after all. One of the sisters, named Dawoon, pointed her finger in front of her and reminded her that she had already told her to make it stronger. The second sister, named Ariam, leaned on her feet and looked up at her sister and told her that if she had followed her plan, they would not have been able to finish it before the wave started. Young-pil addressed the sisters by name and asked them what they were doing. He then informed them that Sewoon had arrived, and they had not even greeted him. Ariam and Dawoon turned to Young-pil with surprised expressions. The protagonist looked at the twins with a confused expression on his face, putting his hand to his chin. He thought in surprise that there were several of them. Sewoon then began to talk about how from the 3rd wave he was impressed by how diligently they moved while fighting off the monsters. After that, Sewoon decided that being twins made them twice as noticeable. Ariam and Dawoon looked at Sewoon in surprise with their cheeks red and shouted in unison, "It's a bloody wolf." Sewoon was confused at being called a bloody wolf. He repeated in his mind, "Bloody wolf." After that, he thought that he just couldn't get used to it. The protagonist put his hand in front of him with a confused expression and thought tensely that all this happened because of a fool named Young-pil. The protagonist remarked that it was a good job. He said this about the rough and short fence made of thick logs that were wrapped with rope. He then asked them if they bought tools with points. Ariam answered in the affirmative, and raised her hands high above herself, and shouted that Seoa told her about it. After that, Dawoon put her hand in front of herself and noticed that even though the fence was like this now, this fence was very useful against the red wolves. Then Aryam said that these would be useful in the next wave as well. Dawoon looked at her sister with a worried expression and noticed that they needed more wood and that they wouldn't be able to prepare for the next one together. The protagonist looked at the twins with condescension and thought that the wooden barricades wouldn't help much in the 10th wave, but the reason he was paying attention to these two was that the system window showed information that the Black Clintock constellation was watching the player named Aryam from the tip of a spear. At this time, the Black Raven constellation spread its wings in front of the player Dawoon. The protagonist looked at the felled logs and thought about the 38th rank Demon Lord Halphas and the 39th rank Demon Lord Malphas. The protagonist understood that each of them had the ability to build and fortify. From this, Sewoon concluded that these two abilities combined should be very useful in battle. He turned to the twin sisters or told them that he would deal with the tree himself. Dawoon and Aryam looked at Sewoon with surprised expressions, after which their eyes began to glow and their cheeks turned red. They asked him if this was true, and then the sisters began to shout in surprise and fervently that the bloody wolf was the best. Sewoon, breathing heavily from his lungs, noted that, however, he would like them not to call him by that name. Some time after these events, Sewoon approached a forest that consisted of tall trees. Yoongpil ran after him, followed by Aryam and Dawoon in sync. When Sewoon entered the forest, he stretched out his sword in front of him and carefully looked at how the sun's rays shimmered on the blade of it. Aryam, leaning her hands on Yoongpil and looking at Sewoon, asked him if he would chop wood with a sword. Then Dawoon asked him if she should bring him an axe. Yoongpil at this moment looked at the twins, who were addressing Sewoon through him, in confusion. The protagonist, without looking at them, answered them negatively and informed them that everything was fine. After that, he swung his sword and made a sharp blow to one of the trees. A flash of energy from the contact of the sword with the dense tree bark illuminated the space around him. The protagonist began to cut the dense and wide tree trunk. Dawoon and Aryam clenched their palms into fists and raised them up, shouting at him that he was very strong. Yoongpil showed him his outstretched thumbs and informed Sewoon that he was amazing. Sewoon, looking at the half-cut tree trunk, thought that in his current state, this was his limit without using internal energy. Then he looked at his reflection in the blade of the sword and thought that this was a sword that cuts a rock named Durandal. The protagonist came to the conclusion through mental reasoning that if the master's strength is not enough, then the Durandal will not even be able to cut a tree properly. Then Sewoon closed his eyes and thought that they still had a long way to go. A notification appeared on the system window that the greed storage was opened. The protagonist, clutching the Durandal in his hands, saw that a notification appeared on the system window that he had taken out the Taishan 18-fold sword from the greed storage. After that, there was an explanation on the system window that this martial art was developed in the Hourglass sect, which is known for its large and powerful physique. The protagonist, with a concentrated expression on his face, clutched the handle of the Durandal with both his hands and thought that in order to cut a tree with one blow, this martial art would be perfect. After that, Sewoon made a sharp sweeping blow using the Durandal and easily cut through the dense trunk of a tall tree. Moments after Sewoon made his strike, a huge tree fell to the ground with a loud sound, causing birds to fly away in all directions. Aryam shouted with an admiring expression that he had struck the thick tree twice. Yoongpil shouted that he was great. A notification appeared on the system window, informing them that the second skill of the Taishan 80-fold sword Tashin Igek was being strengthened due to the internal energy. The Durandal in Sewoon's hands glowed with a bright magical light. Sewoon sent a powerful stream of magical energy between the rows of trees. Soon after, a large number of centuries-old wide trees began to fall in all directions, cut down in one sharp and powerful move. Yoongpil, Aryam and Dawoon watched what had happened with sincere bewilderment and wide-open mouths. The protagonist turned to them and asked them not to worry about transportation. He informed them that Yoongpil would handle it. Yoongpil, perplexed, raised his hands up and asked him, "What?" And then he asked him again, "Do all this on his own?" Sewoon looked at him with a smile on his face and answered affirmatively, calling him his right hand. After these words, the constellation donkey-headed scoundrel, holding his stomach, laughed hard, watching the player named Yoongpil. Yoongpil, with a sad expression on his face, looked gloomily in front of him. When night fell, Yoongpil, with a shaking body and great tension, carried large logs. Heavily turning to Sewoon, he told him that he could not do it anymore. Immediately after that, Yoongpil fell to the ground, dropping the log from his hands. The main character turned to him and ordered him to stop. And then Sewon thought that despite the fact that it was a joke, he was able to drag 3 logs. Youngpil tiredly looked in front of him lying on the ground and thought that this was too much. The protagonist realized that he was originally going to leave it to Hanchyeol. Hanchyeol was carrying several huge logs at once as if these logs weighed nothing. Dawoon addressed him and shouted to him that he was very strong. Aryam shouted loudly and joyfully that with him they would be able to expand the barricades. Sewon, watching the events taking place, came to the conclusion that now he was finished with the twins and he should go further. He noticed the street infirmary, which was under a canopy made of foliage. He decided that he should go there. When Sewon approached, he saw how the wounded players were groaning in pain. One of the men said that he could not feel his arm. Hanyeol put her hand in front of her and used a healing spell and asked him to wait a minute. After that, she shouted to him that she would heal this man and then deal with him. Sewon's mind had memories that this was Hanyeol and they had already communicated with her more than once. After that, Sewon remembered that she had always been at the forefront of treating patients and was engaged in treatment without using various tools. The protagonist drew his attention to the fact that Hanyeol, putting her hand in front of the wounded man, formed a magic ball of healing energy. On the system window it was written that the constellation of a bloody lion was growling softly and licking the blood that was scattered around the player named Hanyeol. Hanyeol, with a tense expression on her face, tried to heal the wounded man. The protagonist, looking at this, thought that she was chosen by the great demon named Marba, who occupies the 5th place. The protagonist thought that he was able to both cause and cure diseases. After that, Sewon approached Hanyeol and suggested that it seemed that she still did not know how to fully control the power of the constellation. He approached Hanyeol from behind and offered her to share roles. Hanyeol looked at him with a surprised expression on her face. The protagonist, looking at her, told her that he would deal with patients with severe external wounds and she with internal ones. Then he explained to her that with the power of Marba it would be more effective. Hanyeol looked at him with a surprised expression on her face and asked him how he was. And then she got to her feet and agreed with him. The protagonist opened the storage of greed and took out a healing spell from there. After that he began to use a healing spell on the tortured man who was lying opposite him. Hanyeol, watching this in surprise, told him that his skills really improved. After that she informed him that he was impressive before, but not that much. The protagonist, healing the wounded man, thought that this was natural since healing was a spell of the 2nd circle, so it was much more powerful than the spell of the 1st circle. Without looking at Hanyeol, he told her that soon she would heal better than him. Hanyeol looked at him in surprise and asked again, "Her?" Sewon, with a smile on his face, looking at her, told her that the constellation with which she made a contract was so strong. On the system window, information was written that the constellation of a bloody lion scratches its mane, feeling a strange satisfaction after praising a person, and the constellation of a bowed raven nods, thinking that the description perfectly suits the Lord of Hell. The protagonist carefully looked above himself, and thought that these constellations can sometimes be unexpectedly cute. Some time after this, in the street infirmary, Sewon turned to Hanyeol and told her to call him if she needed his help. Hanyeol agreed with him with a smile on her face and thanked him for his help. Sewon walked away and began to think about the fact that she had a contract with Marba. In addition, Sewon was thinking about how the structure of the camp was stronger than he expected. He asked himself, who would have thought that everything would change so much while he was in the Rocky Mountain? Sewon looked away and decided to check who was next. The protagonist turned his attention to Changsuk, who was sitting near a tree stump and forging a metal component of a weapon. Near Changsuk, there was a weapon stand with 3 spears. Changsuk was hitting the metal with a hammer with an enthusiastic expression. The protagonist turned to him. Changsuk raised his surprised face and noticed that Sewon was there. The protagonist realized that the equipment that Seoa and Hancheol were using was all made by Changsuk in his opinion. Looking back at Seoa and Hancheol's new weapons, Sewon concluded that the quality was top-notch, as if they were custom-made. Changsuk held his hands out in front of him with an admiring expression and asked in confusion, "What kind of sword is this?" Sewon thought about what he had expected and immediately noticed. Changsuk was holding Durandal in his hands in true admiration. Changsuk's eyes sparkled with delight. Opening his mouth wide, he spoke loudly about how he had thought where it had disappeared to, but it turned out that he had returned this masterpiece of a sword. Sewon told Changsuk to be careful, after which Sewon explained to him that he could burn a hole in it with his gaze. Changsuk then calmed down, cleared his throat into his fist and asked him, "So what's the matter?" He assumed that this sword probably didn't even need to be sharpened. The protagonist took a stone out of his pocket and asked him if he could take a look at it first. Sewoon pulled the stone towards Chansuk. Above the system window there was a message that the constellation of the soldiers of the Golden Crown was habitually fiddling with his crown, considering that the material was quite suitable for use. Chansuk, with an interested expression on his face, thoughtfully put his hand to his chin and noticed that this was a rather unique ore. The protagonist, looking at the stone he was holding in his hand, thought that, as expected, Chansuk immediately recognized it. Sewoon understood that this was a hazelnut stone that he had received for defeating the monkey boss on the Rocky Mountain. The protagonist thought that among the stones that could be mined at this stage, this stone was one of the best. Then turning to Chansuk, he said that he hoped that he could make armor out of it. Chansuk, with a wide smile on his face, put his hands on his hips and said that of course he had already made weapons for everyone in this camp. The protagonist, looking at him seriously, asked if he could finish before the next wave. Chansuk turned his attention to the system window, which said that the remaining time until the 10th wave of monsters was 22 hours and 3 minutes. Looking at this, Chansuk thoughtfully said that judging by the remaining time, they had a little leeway, then turned to Sewoon and asked him if there was a reason why he was in a hurry. Sewoon answered in the affirmative and explained that he planned to give it his all in the next wave. Sometime after these events, Sewoon fought Hanchyeol. He dealt him a strong side kick. Hanchyeol, with a tense expression, defended himself from this blow by putting his hand in front of himself. The protagonist, turning to Hanchyeol, suggested that he had changed a lot. Then he asked him if that was true. Hanchyeol noticed that he had too, after which Hanchyeol said that he had always been a monster, but now he had become an even bigger monster. The protagonist, with a smile on his face, looked at him and asked him if that was a compliment. And then Sewoon told Hanchyeol that he had even mastered Tai Chi quite well despite never having been taught it. Hanchyeol explained to him that when it came to learning through the body, he had the ability to do so. After that, Sewoon noted that, however, this was not quite maximizing his strengths. Hanchyeol, with a surprised expression on his face, looked at Sewoon and asked him again, his strengths? Sewoon, making a sharp jerking movement forward, answered him affirmatively and said that his strengths were. After that, Sewoon, in a jump, prepared to make a new attack. Hanchyeol abruptly stood in a fighting stance, putting his hands in front of his face. A message appeared on the system window stating that the storage of greed had been opened. The protagonist used the Jinju End Fist, which was a fighting technique of the Jinju family. On the system window there was an explanation that this is a martial art that specializes in hand-to-hand combat with a signature move known for using necromancy techniques from the Jinju family, that is, one of the 5 great clans. The protagonist with a brightly glowing fist looked attentively at Hanchyeol. Hanchyeol, perplexed, looked ahead, opened his mouth wide and clenched his fist. After that, their fists collided, creating a powerful surge of energy. Hanchyeol, with a tense expression on his face, frowning his brows, looked ahead while his hand shook. The protagonist looked ahead from under his brows with a gloomy expression and a confident stance. A notification appeared in front of him that due to the internal energy, the first technique of the Jinju fist is the Kungchi fist, that is, the zombie fist is strengthened. After this powerful blow, Hanchyeol was thrown back and retreated several meters, painfully exhaling air from his lungs. Seoa watched this with a frightened expression and wide-open eyes, covering her mouth with her hand. Hanchyeol frowned and looked at his shaking palm. After that, he said, "This punch." He noticed that it was a strong punch. Steam was coming out of Sewoon's clenched fist. Turning to Hanchyeol, he told him that this is how he can unleash his full potential. Then he told him that once his form is complete, he will teach him mental techniques as well. Hanchyeol answered him that he understood. After that, Sewoon turned to the side and said that now. After that he asked, "Young-pil?" A moment later, Young-pil appeared in front of Sewoon in a helpful pose. The protagonist turning to Young-pil suggested that he was free now. After that he asked him, "Isn't that right?" Young-pil rubbed the palms of his hands at the same time answering him affirmatively. Why did he shout that he had cleared his schedule to answer his call at any time? Sewoon, looking at Young-pil, told him in that case then they would argue a little with Hanchyeol. Hanchyeol crossed his arms on his chest and looked menacingly at Young-pil. Young-pil, with a horrified expression on his face from which beads of sweat were flowing abundantly, asked Sewoon again. After that, Young-pil began to step back, laughing confusedly and telling Sewoon that he needed to do something very important. The main character did not listen to him and turning to Hanchyeol told him to use him as he wanted. Hanchyeol told him that he would not hold back, after which he grabbed Young-pil by the collar with a sharp movement of his hand and began to drag him away, telling him that he was counting on him. after which Hancheol tried several times to call Young-pil by name, but he failed. Young-pil, with tears in his eyes actively moving his hands in surprise and fear, asked him, "He does not even remember his name?" After that, he loudly screamed negatively, addressing Sewoon. A notification appeared on the system window that the constellation donkey-headed scoundrel was rolling on the floor laughing. From the loud cry of Young-pil, the birds that were calmly sitting on the crowns of the trees flew away. Some time after that, the blades of the swords collided, making the sound of clanging metal. Seoa with sharp and active movements attacked Sewoon with her swords. The main character looking at her thought that her style is completely different from Hancheol's style since she knows how to make the most of her strengths. The main character defended himself from the huge number of blows that Seoa inflicted on him. Sewoon understood that her form was almost nothing to criticize. However, he understood. After that, Sewoon with a sharp movement of his hand directed the sword to the side and put it in the sheath, telling Seoa that her technique is good, but she lacks strength. Seoa asked him again in surprise, "Strength?" Sewoon told her that it is good when she confronts many weak monsters, but when it comes to one strong monster, then one's speed and technique will not do. A notification appeared on the system window that the crowned spider constellation nods in agreement. Seoa noticed that even the red-skinned monster is already strong enough. After that, she bit her lip with a tense expression and looked at the ground. The main character told her that every time he left the camp, he encountered boss monsters, and these monsters are much stronger than the usual ones that appear during the waves. Seoa looked at him in surprise and said that this means that the reason he became so strong is because of these boss monsters. After that, Sewoon said that he assumed that the boss monster might appear in the next wave. The protagonist at that moment understood that this was not just a prediction but a fact. However, he could not say it directly. Seoa looked ahead with a thoughtful expression on her face. Frowning, Sewoon looking at her thought that Seoa would decide the rest herself. He looked ahead with a smile and said that from now on, he expected her to lead the camp well. Seoa smiled and confidently looked at him, holding her sword in front of her, and loudly shouted, "Yes." After that, a notification appeared on the system window that within the first chapter of the training called Adaptation, there were 5 minutes left until the 10th and final wave of monsters. The protagonist looked at the new red armor that he was wearing. Chang-suk asked him what he would say about it. After that, Chang-suk asked him if he liked it. The system window said that this is the armor of the Red Wolf, which has a rank of C-. In the description of this armor it was said that this is a set of armor made of red wolf skin with inclusions of monkey hazel stone. After that, the system window said that the abilities of this armor are to increase attack power by 10%, as well as the ability to cause fear in monsters that are weaker than this armor. After that, there was a mention that this armor significantly increases defense and durability. The protagonist with a smile on his face looking at his armor answered Chang-suk affirmatively, telling him that it exceeded all his expectations. The protagonist reasoned that he did not think that he would receive a C- rank. After that, Sewoon began to think that given that this armor is imbued with Barrett technology, this is understandable. At this time, Chang-suk and Barrett with proud expressions on their faces looked ahead with their arms crossed over their chests. The system window said that the warrior constellation with the golden crown claimed that his technique was inside the armor and guaranteed its functionality. The protagonist turned to Chang-suk with a serious expression and told him that he should take refuge in the forge. Chang-suk called out to Sewoon and loudly told him that he needed to see his masterpiece shine. Then Chang-suk showed his thumb with a wide smile on his face and noted that he would also be able to handle the monsters just fine. Then he asked Sewoon if that was true. Sewoon looked at Chang-suk with a smile and told him to stay behind everyone then. Some time after that, the system window high in the sky said that within the first chapter of the tutorial called Adaptation, the last 10th wave was starting and the system window ordered the players to defend themselves from the wave of monsters and prove their condition. The voice said that they were coming. After that, a huge number of angry red wolves came out into the field. In addition to the red wolves, there were also angry red monkeys that were armed with various melee weapons. One of the players asked with a worried expression, "Aren't these the monsters they have already encountered?" Another player with a smile on his face holding a sword in his hand asked him if he called these monsters bosses. An angry growling big red boar, one of the players came out into the field in bewilderment asked, "And yet aren't there too many of them?" Seoa clutching a sword in his hand shouted that these are the monsters they have already defeated. After that, she loudly ordered everyone to remain calm and line up around the barricades. After that, Seoa looked ahead in bewilderment with her mouth wide open. She saw a huge grey wolf raising its mouth upward. A notification appeared on the system window that a red fawn named Cannel had appeared. Kano looked menacingly ahead. There were a huge number of scars on his body. Hanyul screamed in fear that it was a boss monster. Ariam screamed that there was more, then she asked to look over there. In the direction she was pointing, there was a huge blue boar that began to howl menacingly while above its head on the system window it was written that a red horn named Pag had appeared. Then the system window notified the players that a red claw named Yashak had appeared. Yashak is a tall purple monkey that was armed with a metal shield and a sword of enormous height. The players stood in a ring surrounded by a huge number of different red monsters. The players with horrified expressions on their faces fearfully said that they were finished and that all this was pointless. They fearfully turned to Seoa as the leader and asked her what they were doing now. Seoa, with a confused expression on her face, looked ahead clutching two swords in her hands. She looked at her feet with a confused look and said what it was. She mentally shouted, "Sewoon." Her hands were shaking with fear. Suddenly Sewoon appeared from behind her and ran forward at great speed. The system window said that due to the current cardio training, the power of the technique is strengthened. Sewoon rushed to attack the huge wolf Kano and instantly began to tear his flesh with his powerful sharp blows of the sword. The system window said that due to the internal energy of the third form of fencing of the blood wolf, which is called the attack of the blood wolf, gains power. The red wolves with frightened muzzles looked in bewilderment as Sewoon tormented the Kano. A new notification on the system window notified that the nearby red wolves were seized with fear due to the effect of the armor of the red wolf, and also the cloak of the gray wolf increases the horror of the enemy. Sewoon, without looking at the players, turned to Seoa and Hancheol and then, looking at them gloomily, sharply ordered them not to interfere. Seoa and Hancheol looked at him in surprise and fear as he spoke. The protagonist raised his palm and began to concentrate magical, energetic and electrical energy in his hands. A notification appeared on the system window that, thanks to the mastery of the Black Tower, the power of chain lightning was strengthened. Immediately after that, Sewoon pointed his hand towards the Kano and provoked a powerful electric discharge, due to which the Kano began to howl in pain, raising his muzzle high up. The protagonist, looking at the Kano in surprise, asked himself, was he always so weak? Sewoon thought about how he used to be terrifying and exterminated people left and right. Now Sewoon, with an unperturbed expression on his face, directed the energy discharge to the side. The protagonist answered himself negatively, thinking that it must be that he had become much stronger. Suddenly Kano turned red. His brightly glowing eyes looked in front of him. A notification appeared on the system window that the red fawn named Kano was going berserk. Kano began to burn with a bright flame rushing forward. He growled menacingly and quickly approached Sewoon. Sewoon, looking at him, thought that before the regression, this attack destroyed almost the entire camp with one blow. Now Sewoon, holding Durandal in his hands, calmly looked in front of him, realizing that now he knows all of his techniques and skills. The main character looked at the enemy through the blades of his sword. When Kano approached Sewoon, Sewoon thrust his blade into the giant wolf's jaw, thinking that he would use his discharged power against him and reflect it. The sword blade passed through Kano's teeth. After that, Kano raised his mouth high and began to howl loudly. Sewoon moved back with a swift movement. At great speed he went around Kano and struck the skull with the blade of his sword while jumping. He thrust his sword deep into the flesh of the huge monster, after which Kano began to roar loudly in pain. A notification appeared on the system window that he had defeated a famous monster named Kano's Red Fang, and his personal contribution points increased by 400, and also by defeating a famous monster alone he gets 4,000 additional points. After that it was written that he received Kano's Fang. The protagonist stood near the corpse of the defeated boss. Soon after that he began to eat the body of the boss using the mouth of the hungry prince. A message appeared on the system window that he ate the red fang of the Kano, and by absorbing its essence his strength increases by 5 and agility by 10. Then the system window notified Sewoon that fear among the red wolves is growing. The red wolves slowly retreated back, looking ahead in fear. The protagonist, looking at them, thought that now that their leader is dead, the others are disoriented. He turned to the players and ordered them to deal with them. One of the players with a frightened expression obeyed Sewoon. The protagonist ran in the other direction, thinking that if the red wolves are in such a state, they can cope with them. Then Sewoon realized that he needed to look at the rest of the boss monsters. At this time, Hancheol was squeezing Paga's fangs with his hands. He stood in front of a huge monster with brass knuckles on his hands. The protagonist looked at him and thought about how to face this giant monster head-on using only force. The protagonist smiled, thinking that it was definitely Hancheol. After that, a notification appeared on the system window that Paga's red horn was using earthquake. Pag sent a powerful energy wave towards Hancheol, tearing the ground in its path. Hanchio began to approach the monster with a swift jerking movement, holding his knuckles in front of him. Soon after, Hanchio hit the ground with his knuckles with great force. The protagonist looked at him and realized that he had neutralized the dungeon with his skill. Hanchio looked menacingly in front of him, holding his fist on the ground. The protagonist realized that he had adapted well to the power of the Agar's constellation. Then Sewoon approached Hanchio from behind and asked him if he remembered the first technique of the Jinju and fist. Hanchio looked back at him and said that if this is the first form, then he can handle it. The main character agreed with him and, taking his sword in his hand, ordered Hanchio to follow him. After that, Sewoon quickly walked around Pag from the side. Pag began to turn towards Sewoon. The main character began to concentrate energy in his hand, after which his hand began to glow bright blue. An inscription appeared on the system window stating that the first technique of the Jinju and fist, called the Kongsi fist, was being strengthened with the help of internal energy. With an incredibly powerful blow from his hand, Sewoon hit Pag's massive fang and broke this dense horn into a huge number of fragments. Hanchio at that moment attacked the huge monster from the opposite side. A notification appeared on the system window stating that the constellation of the old man on the crocodile willingly transferred the power of the earthquake to his warrior. With a furious expression on his face and bulging veins, Hanchio looked ahead, concentrating powerful energy in his hand. A notification appeared on the system window that the player's fist Hanchio was strengthened. Pag, opening his mouth wide and taking out his tongue, began to scream loudly in pain after Hanchio dealt him a crushing blow. From such a powerful blow, the multi-ton boss boar was thrown several meters away. A message appeared on the system window that he had defeated the famous red-horned monster named Pag. The main character looked at Hanchio with a smile on his face. Hanchio at this time looked at his palm in sincere bewilderment with confusion. Hanchio stood over the defeated monster. A system window appeared above him, saying that he had defeated the famous red-horned monster, Pag. He clenched his fist while looking at the dead monster, and the system window notified him that he had received Pag's heart as a reward, and his personal merit had increased by 400 points. Hanchio thoughtfully said while looking at his fist, "Is this what real strength looks like?" He furrowed his brows while thinking about it, and the protagonist replied with a smile that it was. Jeong Sewoon said that once he got used to it, he would be able to use such strength without the help of the constellations. Hanchio continued to silently stare at his fist, thinking about what had been said to him in silence. The system again sent a notification through the system window that the protagonist had eaten the red fang, Pag. He also absorbed the nutrients from it, increasing Sewoon's strength by 5 and his stamina by 10. The hungry prince constellation happily feasted on the tender meat. These streams of energy continued to devour the boar, mercilessly tearing at the animal's flesh. Turning back, the protagonist asked Hanchio if he could handle the rest of the boars. Hanchio at this time threw one of the boars away with his fist, answering that he would certainly do so. Saying that he was counting on him, the protagonist hurried in the other direction with a smile on his face. Heading towards the rocky mountain, Sewoon thought that the test was not over yet. Yuseoa furiously shouted to all the camp members to have no fear. She pressed her sword to her chest, confidently shouting at the wounded to retreat behind the barricades immediately. She was surrounded by demonic monkeys, but confidently fought off these creatures with her sword. Looking at her, Sewoon thought that Seoa was even better than he thought. He guessed in his mind that it was a display of her talent along with the power of the constellation. Suddenly, the protagonist's attention was caught by a scream. Jeong, hugging bananas, screamed at the monkey for them to catch him if they can. Sewoon turned around, wondering, could that be the same voice? Jeong was running away from the monkeys, screaming at them that they couldn't catch him, so that's why they were mad, right? He laughed loudly, making his way between the monkeys, while the constellation donkey-headed rascal rolled on the ground, asking for someone to stop his laughter. Sewoon looked at this with a puzzled and confused look, wondering why he was running around and angering all the monkeys. However, he then realized that Jeong was not just running around for no reason. As he ran back and forth, he gradually took away the weapons from the monkeys. Sewoon thought that he was stealing the red monkey's equipment, so he concluded that Jeong seemed to have mastered the stealing skill, which was the ability of the 6th-ranked demon, Velafor. After collecting all the monkey's weapons, Jeong began to run away with a laugh and a smile on his face. The protagonist thought that it was good for them anyway. Suddenly, after an attack, the walls built by the humans collapsed. It was the monkey Yashak who managed to break through the defense. Seoa shouted that the barricade had collapsed, so she ordered everyone to retreat. She said that she would deal with the famous monster. Seoa was giving orders as the head of the camp, but she was interrupted by Jeong Sewoon, who called her by name, making her pay attention to him. Seoa turned around in surprise and answered him, asking why he was there. She worriedly asked him, "What is happening to the other places?" Sewoon confidently told her that it had already been taken care of, so she didn't have to worry. He told her that they had to finish off that monster while looking at their opponent. Seoa furrowed her brows and confidently agreed, thanking the protagonist. At this time, the monkey Yashak continued to approach them with battle cries. The protagonist grabbed the hilt of his sword, heading towards their enemy, and Seoa, holding her swords tightly, also charged. The monkey Yashak put up a shield, blocking Seoa's first strike. The protagonist thought that for someone who used two swords, the monster with a shield was a difficult opponent. However, Seoa was handling the shield quite well. She continued to take more hits, gradually destroying the opponent's shield. Sewoon nodded, looking at this confrontation with satisfaction. Seoa continued to use combat techniques, attacking the enemy with a serious face. Taking a look at Seoa, the protagonist immediately saw her weak point, wondering, did she have a problem with her legs? Sewoon thought that she was quite skilled with the sword, but her legs couldn't keep up with her skill. Seoa took another step, unsure of stopping. Then the protagonist approached her, calling Seoa by name, telling her to follow in his footsteps from now on. Seoa turned around, looking at Sewoon, asking him, did she really have to do this now? The protagonist told her that the fastest way to learn was through actual combat. He smiled, looking at the armored monkey, leaving Seoa behind him. The system notified him that the greed storage had been opened again. This time the protagonist took out the Camille Dual Sword skill. It was the mercenary King Camille Dual Sword skill, said to be one of the 5 in existence. His speed and trajectory of movement immediately changed. Jeong Sewoon was rapidly approaching the enemy. The peculiarity of this skill was the movement of the legs. Like a leaf in a hurricane, no one could catch up with Camille. The protagonist was getting closer to the enemy. His movements became so impressive that Seoa involuntarily wondered what kind of movements were these. She looked with interest at how Sewoon moved, and in the meantime, he took out a blade from a boar's tusk, with a menacing look, flew into the air, swung and soared right above the monkey. The monkey Yashak looked up, shocked looking at how the enemy literally hovered above the monkey's head. It took the protagonist only a few movements of the sword to inflict serious wounds on the enemy, leaving the monster behind him. When Sewoon ran out of monkey, he landed behind this one, and the monkey Yashak screamed loudly in pain. Seoa had been watching the protagonist closely the entire time, and then, concentrating and exhaling the air from her lungs, she pushed off the ground, trying to replicate what she had just seen from Sewoon. The two of them began to throw more and more punches at the armor and skin of the Yashak monkey, trying to defeat it as quickly as possible. Sewoon told her with a smile on his face that she was holding up well, and Seoa just kept trying, biting her lips in concentration. The protagonist told her to try to be faster. Then he and Seoa began to move with even greater speed, literally creating a whirlwind of punches above the frightened armored monkey. The monkey stood there, looking at them literally circling in the air with confusion. But they weren't going to entertain the monkey for too long. A few well-placed punches to the legs and the monkey was injured. The monkey howled in rage and pain, dropping its shield, which was the last mistake in the life of this monster. As soon as the monkey lost its defense, Seoa and the protagonist immediately appeared right in front of it, cutting through the enemy's body and decapitating the monster in the next moment. The system window immediately sent a notification that they had defeated the famous monster, the Red Claw, Yashak. Sewoon and Seoa's personal merits were increased by 400 points, and they also received the Yashak sword. After they dealt with the main monkey, the other red monkeys began to run away in fear, not daring to attack people anymore. Taking a deep breath, Seoa happily said that it was finally over. She breathed heavily, looking after the fleeing monkeys. The system sent out a system window to everyone, saying that the tutorial, Chapter 1, Adaptation, was finished. Everyone had successfully passed the 10th wave, so the system congratulated everyone on finishing the first chapter of the tutorial. Seoa raised her gaze upward, looking at this. The twins also happily started shouting that it was over. They cursed the waves of monsters, saying that they were finally free. However, Kang Hancheol still looked around in disbelief, while Dawoon and Aryam hugged each other with tears in their eyes, happily saying that it was a great job. The protagonist thought that it was too early to celebrate. His gaze became serious, as he thought about this. In front of the people who hoped that their nightmare had come to an end, a new system window appeared. Everyone looked at what was said in surprise. For a few moments, the camp was silent. After reading what was written there, Yu Seoa hesitantly turned to Jeong Sewoon, asking him what it meant. The protagonist, closing his eyes, calmly replied that it meant exactly what was written there. This system window said that the second chapter of the training, which was called the March, had begun, so now all the people had to reach their destination by traveling across the plains. They had 167 hours and 59 minutes left until their arrival. Sewoon folded his arms across his chest, saying that it was time to leave this place. The people immediately became agitated, hesitantly asking each other, do they really have to leave? One of the campers said that he was just starting to get used to this place. The protagonist knew that the theme of the first training chapter was adaptation, so as expected, the people adapted and survived in this wild place with fierce determination. He looked at everyone with his stern eyes, thinking that it was only natural to feel uneasy when leaving the environment they had adapted to. Seoa turned to the campers, asking them to calm down. But one of the twins named Dawoon excitedly asked the people present where they thought they were going. She said in a cheerful voice that they might find a village. She had a smile on her face as she said this, thoughtfully placing her hand on her chin. The other twin, Ariam, supported her, saying with the same excitement that if they found a village, the first thing she would want to do would be take a bath. She raised her fist up to show her determination, and her sister Dawoon asked, what if there were monsters along the way? However, Ariam immediately told her that it didn't matter, since they had already dealt with everything. They then asked the members of their camp with happy smiles, is this true, calling everyone brothers and sisters. Their eyes were literally shining. The mood of the people immediately changed, they began to smile again, saying that it was true. Now they believed that if they had dealt with this challenge, then nothing else should be a problem for them, right? The protagonist thought that the mood had improved a little thanks to the twins, and then thoughtfully chuckled to himself when his attention was drawn to the twins. They gestured to him that they had done this on purpose, so Sewoon thought with a smile on his face that it was clear to him that this was the plan, since they had been helped again. The aftermath of the 10th wave was quickly eliminated. Monster corpses, destroyed barricades, and many broken weapons were scattered everywhere. The people who were used to living there moved in harmony. The cook cut the meat from the captured monsters using the knife they made, and then handed the skins to Go Chang-suk. There was a lot of work considering the number of monsters captured, but thanks to the coordinated work, everything was completed quickly. After receiving the cut skins, he headed to make new items to maintain life in the camp. The protagonist recalled that before the regression, there were not many survivors. He looked around the camp with an appraising glance, reasoning that the atmosphere was worse then, so they left the camp unplanned. Suddenly, his gaze was drawn to the twins Ariam and Dawoon chatting with each other. He looked at them in surprise, while the other people with happy faces were about to leave this place. They were chatting with each other anxiously about something. Sewoon knew that they might have acted bravely in front of everyone, but they did not want to leave the barricade they had built themselves. There was anxiety on their faces, they did not know what to do, because there was a dangerous, unknown future ahead. He approached them from behind, and then cleared his throat, attracting their attention. The twins turned their gaze to Sewoon, and their faces immediately lit up with smiles. They happily said that the blood wolf had come to them. The protagonist cursed this nickname again in his mind, putting his hand on his face in irritation. His anger about this was about to reach its peak, because such a title was not just a nickname. Jeong Sewoon recalled that in this reality, when a player's achievements reach a certain point, the system recognizes him as part of the legend. This is what a real title was. Thanks to this, the title directly affects the player's path. It becomes like the direction of the tracks in his history. Some tried to create their own legend for the title, but almost no one succeeded. Many of them ended up with shameful titles that they wanted to hide. Blood Wolf Sewoon didn't sound like much, but after thinking about it, the protagonist came to the conclusion that it probably wasn't such a bad title. He raised his gaze to the twins, thinking about it in his mind. Dawoon asked Sewoon in surprise what brought him here. Ariam asked him with a happy smile, did he really come to hang out with them? The protagonist went silent in embarrassment, putting his finger to his cheek, and then modestly thanked them for the moment when they kept the morale of the camp up, looking away in embarrassment. The twins froze for a second, looking at Sewoon in surprise, and then looked at each other, smiling conspiratorially at each other. Ariam immediately spoke up, saying that it didn't cost them anything. Dawoon supported her by saying that since they were leaving anyway, they didn't need to dwell on it. She jokingly added that maybe it was gratitude for all the firewood he helped them cut. Sewoon, still embarrassed, placed his hand on the back of his head, asking them if they needed anything. He closed his eyes, feeling awkward. Aryam thoughtfully looked down, placing her hand on her chin, asking herself again, do they really need anything? Dawoon immediately answered confidently that she had something in mind. She asked Jeong Sewoon if she could tell him. Dawoon pointed her finger to another part of the camp, and then they moved there. When they were there, she pointed to the animal skin bags that were lying on the ground. The protagonist asked in confusion, asking them to wait, were these really for putting corpses in? Dawoon asked him back in an offended tone, then shouted that these were sleeping bags that were made from monster skins. Sewoon wondered in his mind, were these really where the campers were sleeping? He didn't know, since he kept his distance from the others the whole time. After all, if you move too fast, it becomes difficult to remain objective. After examining the bags, he turned to the twins, folding his arms across his chest, asking them why they showed him this. Aryam told him that this wasn't all, since they needed to carry equipment, emergency rations, and more. There were indeed many things lying around that the campers needed to take with them. Aryam said that she thought they could make a cart, but even so, they wouldn't be able to carry all of this. After all, if they all push it, it will only slow them down. She thoughtfully put her hand to her chin, looking at all the things around. Sewoon thought in surprise that she had been thinking about this all this time. The protagonist asked them why the two of them didn't go and make a cart. Aryam asked him what he meant. How would they drag it together? Sewoon answered with a smile that there was a way. He thought there were only two options. The first was to tame the monster. He looked at the pile of monster bones that were left after the battle, immediately realizing that the problem with this option was that there were no living monsters there. So he had to use the second option, the only one left. He put his hand forward, using mana, opening the greed storage again, while using the awaken undead skill. The skeleton monsters started to stand up little by little. It was a spell from the necromancers in the Black Tower. It pours mana into the bones and resurrects the dead. It was written in the system window. The dead monsters raised their heads, and then Jeong Sewoon ordered them to stand up with a threatening look. And the skeletons rose to their feet, obeying the protagonist. The campers immediately began to ask anxiously, what is this? One of them pointed a finger at the revived monsters, asking Sewoon, did he really do this? The eyes of the skeleton monsters lit up, and then one of them bowed to Sewoon in respect. The protagonist turned to the man and told him that it was safe, so he did not need to worry. The man asked him in surprise, is this true? Seoa appeared behind them, confidently asking if she could touch it. She extended her hand forward, getting closer to the skeleton monster, and then gently touched one of the tusks of the boar skeleton. The monster did not react in any way, and then she placed her hand on the skull, and the monster only closed his eyes, not resisting it in any way. The curious twins immediately appeared behind Seoa, who excitedly said that it looked like some kind of pet. The three of them looked at the monster with interest, and then, when all the campers realized that it was safe, they all gathered around it, asking in surprise if they could touch it too. The protagonist watched this from afar, looking at it with embarrassment, while everyone else was happy about the appearance of their peculiar common pet. Jeong Sewoon thought that the skeleton only followed the commands of its owner, so all these movements were his instructions. However, considering that the mood was relieved, it was good. The twins and Seoa continued to pet the skeleton with smiles on their faces. After a while, the night fell on the forest. Sewoon lay on his sleeping bag with his hands behind his head, looking up at the night sky. He said that this sleeping bag was surprisingly well made, looking at the object underneath it. The system sent a notification that the Hungry Prince constellation was rubbing his plump belly and sighing contentedly, saying that it was a satisfying meal. Jeong Sewoon closed his eyes, saying that now that he had eaten his fill, he asked him to hold off for a while. The protagonist opened his eyes slightly, mentally recalling the second chapter of the training. Pictures of his comrades being killed appeared in his memories, but he discarded these thoughts, deciding that the past was the past. He immediately thought that he needed to focus only on what was waiting for him ahead. Sewoon turned on his side, closing his eyes with concern. He gradually began to fall asleep, thinking that if he missed this chance, he would not be able to return. However, his rest was interrupted by a strange sensation. He opened his eyes and saw a bird feather slowly falling on him. The system window immediately informed him that the constellation of the bowed crow was lowering its beak and pointing at him. The silhouette of the constellation of the bowed crow appeared in front of him, and Sewoon immediately stood up, asking what was this. A system window appeared next to his sword, where it was written that the constellation of the bowed crow was pointing at his sword, calling for it with greed. The protagonist again wondered in his mind, what was this? The system window changed. Now it said that the constellation of the bowed crow loudly declared that he must sacrifice the sword to it. Jeong Sewoon folded his arms on his chest, asking him with displeasure, why did he need this? The new system window showed information that the constellation of the bowed crow warned that if he refused, it would deprive him of access to the treasure vault. The silhouette of the constellation looked at him silently, but to the surprise of the bowed crow, the protagonist cheekily replied that he should try it. He stretched his hand forward, saying so. Sewoon thought that by using Mammon's power, he realized something. The protagonist smiled as he looked at the silhouette of the constellation, thinking that he thought that the storage was something that Mammon allowed him to use out of curiosity. But he was wrong. The silhouette of the constellation began to shake, and a system window appeared next to it, saying that it was shaking in irritation. The protagonist immediately cheekily told him again that the power he was using was separated from his treasure storage, wasn't it? He smiled as he said this, thinking that it wasn't that he had deprived him of access to the storage, it was something that was beyond his power. Sewoon knew that the power he possessed came from Mammon's vault before the regression. When the protagonist regressed, the physical form of the vault was lost, and only the internal power of it became his power. So Mammon's current threats did not matter. The system window immediately wrote that the constellation of the bowed raven spread its wings threateningly in response to the arrogance of the protagonist. Sewoon thought that, however, provoking him was still very risky. He turned his head to the side, placing his hands on his knees, repeating again that he said that he would not give it to him. Sewoon explained to Mammon that Durandal was the strongest weapon he had at the moment. He took his sword in his hands, offering Mammon to cooperate in creating a copy of Durandal. Sewoon thought that after all, Mammon had the ability to copy items. After all, most of the treasures in his vault were also replicas. He simply created the exact same item and placed it in his treasury. The system window changed, now saying that the constellation of the bowed crow was nodding, thinking that it wouldn't be such a bad thing to add another copy to his collection. The protagonist raised its head up, saying that in exchange for this, he asked for access to the true storage. He held his sword up, extending it towards the constellation. Mammon responded with an angry, even slightly offended look at the protagonist. Jeong Sewoon thought that with his current abilities, he could only borrow the power of the treasure, he couldn't use the real treasure. The new system window said that the constellation of the bowed crow was looking around with obvious awkwardness, as if he was the one at a disadvantage. Mammon stared at the protagonist, who replied that he didn't want an unfair deal either, so he only asked for the low-grade treasures at the entrance to the warehouse. The system immediately wrote in the system window that the constellation of the bowed raven remembered the treasures at the entrance, and thought about it. Sewoon looked at Mammon with a smile, remembering that in his past life he had already entered Mammon's treasure vault, and had a rough idea of how it was arranged. Mammon kept all the rare valuables in the deepest part. This meant that only the lowest grade treasures were near the entrance. Sewoon remembered how in his past life he walked along the corridors of this huge place, looking at all the treasures on the sides. If the condition was to obtain the legendary weapon Durandal, then this should not be a bad deal for Mammon. A few moments later, the system window said that the constellation of the bowed raven accepted the offer. Mammon's eyes sparkled, and behind him, a gate seemed to appear, the very entrance to the treasury. Sewoon confidently said that a contract was needed. He cut his palm with his sword, leaving a bloody wound on his hand and blood on the blade of the sword. A message appeared in the system window that blood was dripping from the feathers of the bowed raven. This blood also fell on the sword, thanks to which the contract with the bowed raven was completed, and the protagonist gained access to a part of Mammon's vault. Dark blood energy began to accumulate around the sword, and then a clot of this energy appeared in Sewoon's hand, as if symbolizing the conclusion of the contract. Sewoon thought that this was excellent. He turned his gaze to Mammon, thinking that he would get what he needed right now. A gate opened in front of him, which led to Mammon's treasure vault. Inside, everything was shining as before, shimmering in shades of gold. A system window appeared in front of the protagonist, where it was said that Mammon's treasure vault was opened. When the protagonist entered, he saw many shelves with various magic items standing on them again. Everything around was shimmering with cleanliness. Jeong Sewoon thought that, as expected, it was hard to find equipment. He walked past these shelves, looking at everything that was on them, because most of the items at the entrance were consumables. Taking one of the vessels that were there, he said that he knew it, and then a system window appeared next to this vessel, where it was said that this was elven forest dew, which belonged to the category of potions. These were transparent drops from the leaves of the world tree, which were weakly saturated with the energy of the world tree. Sewoon drank it without thinking, while Mammon, who was watching this, shuddered in horror, covered in sweat. The protagonist happily said that he would need it, smiling with a satisfied expression. A dissatisfied voice appeared in the system window, a constellation of a raven leaning over the wing of the storage facility according to the agreement, but warned that if the treasures were used recklessly, it would not be forgiven. Mammon glared at the protagonist with dissatisfaction, while the protagonist awkwardly replied that he would do so. Sewoon thought that although he had accepted the offer for the Durandal, he still looked quite worried. Smiling, the protagonist said that he would use the treasures in case of emergency, so he asked Mammon not to worry. Gradually, the night began to approach the morning, and soon the sun rose. Seoa shouted that it was time to move. All the people in the camp gradually packed their things into carts, preparing to leave their camp. One of the campers asked Han Aryam how she did it so quickly. Dawoon, meanwhile, watched their cart being loaded with things, placing her hands on her waist with pride. Aryam was telling one of the people who was carrying the box that her cart was sturdy, so he should carry it there, pointing at her cart. The twins immediately started arguing over whose cart was stronger, looking at each other with displeasure. Seoa, who was passing by, said that both carts were good, so they shouldn't argue. Sewoon, who approached them, looked around, asking them if there was anything he could do to help. Then, when he turned to the side, he wondered in his mind, what is this? One of the people in the camp was carefully looking at the skeleton monster that the protagonist awakened yesterday. Sewoon thought that he didn't remember this person, while this guy named Baekhyun was still looking at the monster with the same delight. Jeong Sewoon wondered if this meant that this person had died before the regression. He walked towards Baekhyun, who stood up straight with a scared expression, accidentally bumping into Sewoon, and immediately apologized to him for it, saying that he was lost in his thoughts. The protagonist immediately asked him if there was any problem. Baekhyun adjusted his glasses, sheepishly saying, it wasn't a problem, it was just something he found fascinating. Sewoon exhaled heavily, looking away, wondering what that meant. Baekhyun quickly began to explain that even in a world where magic exists, someone can stand without ligaments, tendons, or muscles, but could the black mist between the joints be what connects the bones? Baekhyun continued to look at the skeleton with an adoring gaze, and Sewoon turned to look at him in surprise. He wondered in his mind, could it be that he was seeing mana? There were indeed currents of dark mana floating around the bones of these awakened skeletons. Jeong Sewoon thought that Baekhyun seemed to be knowledgeable in related matters. He even wondered if he might have a talent for dark magic. Noticing Sewoon's gaze, Baekhyun turned around, embarrassedly apologizing again, saying that it was his professional habit. Sewoon asked him again about it, asking if he was a doctor. The protagonist placed his hand on his hip, listening attentively to Baekhyun as he answered that it was not exactly like that. Baekhyun awkwardly scratched the back of his head, saying that he was getting a master's degree in anatomy. He apologized again for taking so long to introduce himself, and said his name. Sewoon thoughtfully looked down at him, saying the word anatomy out loud, while pressing his hand to his chin. Baekhyun laughed embarrassedly, saying that unfortunately it doesn't mean much in this world. He said that anatomy doesn't help much in healing or strength. The protagonist smiled, asking himself, what if this person knew how to use mana, and then integrated it into anatomical knowledge? He thought that in that case, Baekhyun would be able to surpass even Hancheol or Seoa. Sewoon turned to Mr. Baekhyun, asking him to sit down for a moment, pointing his hand to the side. Baekhyun immediately hesitated, saying that he needed to help the others. However, Sewoon interrupted him, saying that it would not be for long, taking out a boar-tusk dagger from his sheath. As Baekhyun sat down on the ground, the protagonist began to draw a magic circle around him. Baekhyun asked in surprise, what was it? The ground around him began to glow slightly, and a magic circle appeared on it. The protagonist opened the greed storage again, which was immediately notified by the system. He took out a black magic stone from there, a dark gem that is used by the magicians of the Black Tower as a magic medium. This magic item immediately appeared in Jeong Sewoon's hand, and he threw it into the magic circle next to Baekhyun with a serious face. The stone immediately began to emit dark energy, and Baekhyun, seeing it, asked in surprise, could this be the same fog that was inside the skeleton? Sewoon placed his hands on Baekhyun's shoulders. He told him that it would hurt a little, so he had better grit his teeth and endure it. His face was serious, so Baekhyun looked at him in fear. Sewoon closed his eyes and concentrated, remembering that in the training methods of the Black Tower, there was not only the creation of one's own circle, but also a method of forcibly creating another person's circle. The next moment, Baekhyun's body seemed to be pierced by an electric shock. The protagonist began to pass streams of magical energy through him. Baekhyun cried out in pain, feeling a strange change inside himself. Sewoon told him that he had better keep his mouth shut now, otherwise his heart might burst. His tone was so serious that Baekhyun believed him unquestioningly, gritting his teeth. Mana continued to flow through his body, gradually starting to accumulate inside. Baekhyun squeezed his eyes shut, trying to endure this overwhelming pain. At this moment, Jeong Sewoon thought that his quick reaction showed that he definitely had a talent for this. He silently watched Baekhyun, continuing this unpleasant procedure. Magical energy accumulated inside Baekhyun's chest, enveloping his heart. He straightened up abruptly, screaming in pain again. The protagonist thought that it must be like his heart was being squeezed. Baekhyun's heart continued to beat wildly, enveloped in this unusual energy. Sewoon thought that anyone with a weak will would have already passed out. A magic circle burst out from Baekhyun's chest after a while. This meant that the release of mana had been successfully completed. Then it was over. The protagonist praised Baekhyun with a smile, saying that he had endured everything. Baekhyun's entire body was covered in cold sweat. He frantically tried to say something, trying to come to his senses. The magic stone in front of him gradually began to clear, and the energy from it entered directly into Baekhyun's body. Sewoon thought that this was better than he expected. Very soon, the stone turned completely white, so the protagonist thought that he had absorbed the mana from the high-grade black magic stone very quickly. Baekhyun sighed heavily, lowering his gaze downwards. Jeong Sewoon thanked him for his hard work, and then directed his hand to the skeleton that he had just revived, taking his mana from it. The skeleton collapsed to the ground, and Baekhyun, who had approached the skeleton, looked at its hand, instinctively understanding what he needed to do. He moved its palm forward, releasing some mana from its hand, thus gradually beginning to reassemble the skeleton piece by piece, trying very hard to do everything correctly. Sewoon thought that he was restoring the skeleton from an anatomical point of view. Now the mana was concentrated in the right places. He was fastening the joints with it and creating muscles. The protagonist thought that it was much slower than his method, but now everything was much stronger and more reliable. He remembered with a thoughtful look that this must be why the wizards of the Black Tower examined the corpses. Baekhyun spoke loudly for the skeleton to rise. And the skeleton gradually rose, directing its gaze to its new owner. Baekhyun looked at it excitedly, and suddenly a system window appeared above him, saying that the constellation of the horse trampling death was looking at the player Baekhyun with interest. The silhouette of this god appeared right behind Baekhyun, who was surprised by this system window alone. The protagonist remembered that this was the 4th-rank demon lord, Samijin, the great Marquis of Hell, who was skilled in necromancy and spiritual arts. Baekhyun turned back, looking at the god who was paying attention to him with a trembling face. It was a huge horse, rearing up, looking down at Baekhyun. The protagonist thought that this was the first mage of this camp, but then he corrected himself, thinking that this was the birth of a necromancer.
What gonna happen next? To find out, do like, share, and comment if you want the next part as soon as possible. And also help us by giving supers because your support motivates us a lot to make such type of content. Thanks for watching, sayonara.